Before central heating, electric blankets, or even thick glass windows, people had to get creative just to survive the cold. In the medieval world, winters were long, homes were drafty, and warmth was never guaranteed. Yet somehow they managed. In this video, we'll take a quiet journey through the strangest, most unexpected ways people kept warm inside their homes during the Middle Ages. From sleeping with livestock to heating beds with bricks, their techniques were as clever as they were odd. If you enjoy calming stories about the hidden corners of history, you're in the right place. Feel free to like, subscribe, and let us know where and when you're listening. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. To understand the strange ways people stayed warm in the medieval world, we first have to step into their homes, not through the romantic lens of storybooks or stone castle fantasies, but through the cold breath of real life. The moment you crossed a medieval threshold, especially in the colder months, the chill would greet you like a familiar companion. Whether it was the modest hut of a village laborer or the towering great hall of a feudal lord, warmth was not a given. In fact, the very structures people called home were often their greatest challenge in staying warm at all. A typical peasant dwelling in medieval Europe was built with function, not comfort, in mind. These houses were small, often just a single room, with low ceilings, dirt floors, and walls made of wattle and daub, a mixture of sticks, clay, straw, and mud. That might sound rustic and cozy, but these materials were far from insulating. The wind could slip in through cracks in the walls, and moisture had a habit of clinging to everything. When it rained or snowed, water sometimes dripped through thatched roofs. In winter, the chill crept through the walls, floors, and even the bed covers. In wealthier homes, like manors or small castles, stone construction offered durability and protection, but not warmth. Stone holds the cold like a memory, and without proper insulation, these grand halls could feel like iceboxes. Even with a fire blazing in a central hearth, the heat rarely reached the edges of a room. High ceilings made it worse. The warm air would rise up and vanish, leaving the people below huddled close together and wrapped in layers. Medieval people did not have insulation, as we understand it today. Windows were rare in peasant homes and usually just simple holes in the walls, sometimes covered with oiled parchment or cloth to block the wind. Glass windows were a luxury only the very rich could afford, and even then, early glass was so cloudy and thin that it did little to keep the cold out. Doors were wooden slabs that warped with time and weather, often leaving gaps at the edges where icy air could sneak through. Because of these design flaws, the very idea of indoor and outdoor temperatures became blurry. Inside was only marginally warmer than outside, sometimes not warmer at all. In fact, in the dead of winter, people would often leave their outer layers on even while indoors. Cloaks, hoods, mittens, and woolen stockings were not just for braving the cold outside but were regular parts of indoor life. Even at the dinner table or while sleeping, people stayed bundled. And yet, despite these conditions, life went on. Children played on cold floors, elders tended to cooking fires, and everyone found a way to get through the frostbitten months. Their survival wasn't just due to resilience. It was also thanks to a collection of clever, strange, and sometimes downright odd ways to stay warm. But before we explore those unusual methods, it's worth understanding just how persistent the cold was. Morning routines in the medieval period often began in darkness, especially during winter. The sun rose late and did little to warm the world when it finally arrived. A family would wake to the sound of animals shifting in their stalls or to the rustle of someone starting the fire. But rekindling a fire wasn't always easy. Firewood was precious, and letting a fire go out overnight meant spending cold fingers and valuable time trying to coax it back to life in the morning. That's why many families banked their fires, covering the coals with ashes at night to keep them smoldering, so they could be revived with less effort at dawn. Even with a fire, only the space immediately around the hearth was warm. The further away you got, the more your breath became visible and the more your limbs began to ache with cold. People naturally gathered around the fire as often as they could. It became the center of home life, not just for cooking, but for warmth, storytelling, mending, and working. Meals were taken close to the fire. Children napped near it. Sometimes even animals came in from the cold and curled up nearby, contributing their own body heat to the human struggle. Medieval clothing was a defense mechanism in its own right. While styles varied by class and region, layers were key. Wool was the most common fabric, thick, durable, and naturally insulating. Peasants wore multiple tunics, cloaks, and head coverings, often lined with fur or sheepskin if they could afford it. Linen undergarments provided a base layer that helped trap warmth and wick moisture. Mittens, sometimes made from felted wool, kept hands from stiffening in the cold. Feet were wrapped in cloth or slipped into leather boots, sometimes stuffed with straw or moss for insulation. At night, the cold became a different kind of problem. Once the sun set, the absence of warmth became more noticeable. Beds were often shared, not just between spouses, but among siblings or even servants. This wasn't always a matter of affection, it was practical. Human bodies generate heat, and sharing a bed meant sharing warmth. It was not uncommon for 3 or more people to sleep in the same bed during winter, facing the same direction, cocooned in layers of rough-spun blankets and animal skins. The poorest families sometimes didn't have a proper bed at all, sleeping on straw mats or even directly on the floor, bundled in whatever they had. But straw itself was more than bedding. It was also a form of insulation. Peasants would scatter straw across the floors of their homes to provide a barrier between their feet and the icy ground. Over time, the straw would become mixed with dirt and debris, forming a thick, semi-insulating mat that was occasionally swept out and replaced. In some cases, reeds or rushes were used instead. In the homes of wealthier people, decorative rushes were scattered with fragrant herbs like lavender or rosemary, which added both insulation and pleasant smells to rooms that often became musty in winter. Chimneys, which seem so central to our idea of warm homes today, were not common in early medieval buildings. Many houses simply had a hole in the roof to let smoke escape. This meant that the room would often fill with smoke, stinging eyes and settling soot on everything. But oddly enough, this smoke helped preserve the thatch and kept away pests. People became used to it, and some even saw the lingering warmth of the smoke as a form of protection against the cold and illness. Lighting, too, was part of the equation. Candles and oil lamps were not just sources of illumination, they were tiny beacons of heat. Though they offered only the faintest warmth, in a cold, dark room, even that small flame could be meaningful. In monasteries and noble houses, large candelabras were sometimes used to generate a bit of extra warmth in small spaces, though it was far from efficient. Still, the psychological comfort of firelight made the cold more bearable. Medieval kitchens, often detached from the main house due to fire risk, presented another challenge. Though they generated warmth during the day, that heat rarely traveled far. In some cases, people would carry heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth from the kitchen fire into their living or sleeping quarters. These makeshift warmers were placed at the foot of the bed, in laps, or even tucked into clothing to provide temporary relief. The cold affected more than just comfort. It shaped behavior, routines, and even architecture. People designed their days around the fire, rising only when necessary, conserving movement, and planning chores in proximity to warmth. They cooked stews and porridges that simmered for hours, not just for flavor but for the ambient heat the cooking process generated. In wealthier households, tapestries were hung on walls to block drafts. In monasteries, corridors were designed with south-facing windows to catch what little sunlight winter offered. And yet, despite their cleverness and resolve, the people of the Middle Ages often lived in a state of constant cold during the winter. Their lives were shaped by it, and their traditions grew around it. It was not something they escaped, but something they endured, together, with layers of wool, stacks of straw, crackling fires, and the occasional warm animal tucked close for good measure. This was the backdrop of everyday medieval life in winter, homes that fought against the cold with every tool available, however strange or simple. Now that we understand the reality of just how cold these homes could be, we can begin exploring the more unusual, inventive, and downright odd ways medieval people kept themselves warm. Some of them may surprise you. Some may make you smile. And others may remind you that even in the coldest times, human beings will always find a way to keep the warmth alive. If you had stepped into a medieval home on a frosty winter's night, you might have been startled by what you'd find curled up by the hearth or even nestled into the bed itself. Among the piles of straw, heavy blankets, and layers of woolen clothing, you might discover a snoring piglet, a sheep, a chicken, or perhaps even the family cow in the corner. While it might seem strange or even comical to modern eyes, this practice was deeply rooted in necessity, not eccentricity. In the battle against cold, warmth was not a matter of modesty or decorum. It was a matter of survival. One of the most reliable and available sources of heat in the medieval world wasn't firewood or fabric, it was animals. The body temperature of animals, especially livestock like sheep and cows, is surprisingly effective at generating and radiating heat. In many parts of Europe during the Middle Ages, it was not uncommon for people to live in close quarters with their animals, particularly during the winter months. This arrangement was not merely a matter of convenience or space, but a strategic choice to conserve warmth and share the benefits of body heat. The typical medieval peasant home was a single-room structure that functioned as kitchen, bedroom, and barn all in one. At one end of the room, the family would sleep, often all together in a single bed or on mats made of straw and cloth. At the other end, the animals would be housed, separated only by a low wooden barrier or perhaps a few stones. These animals, cows, goats, pigs, chickens, were critical to the family's livelihood. They provided milk, eggs, wool, and labor. But in winter, they also played a less obvious role, keeping the house warm. The warmth generated by even a few animals could be significant. A cow, for example, produces a steady amount of heat, and in a confined space with limited ventilation, that heat would radiate outward and mingle with the ambient temperature of the room. The animals themselves also benefited from this arrangement. While it's true that many animals were naturally better adapted to the cold, being indoors shielded them from wind, snow, and predators. The shared arrangement was symbiotic. Both humans and animals gained warmth and protection. Beyond livestock, domesticated pets, especially dogs and cats, were sometimes welcome in the bed itself. While pets in the modern sense weren't exactly common in rural medieval homes, working dogs served important functions, such as herding or guarding. At night, they might sleep at their master's feet, not for affection but for warmth. Their presence, though ordinary to those who lived it, added a layer of heat that many relied upon. Even cats, valued for their ability to keep grain stores and pantries free from rodents, were often allowed near the hearth or in sleeping quarters. In some regions, this practice extended beyond the simple presence of animals and evolved into architectural design. The concept of the fire dwelling became widespread in certain areas of northern Europe, especially in Scotland and parts of Scandinavia. These were long, narrow houses in which humans and animals shared the same roof but were separated by an interior wall or division. The warmth from the livestock side would naturally drift into the human side, creating a primitive but effective form of passive heating. Some homes even had raised sleeping platforms built above the livestock stalls to allow the rising heat to drift directly beneath sleeping bodies. But sharing space with animals was not without its challenges. There were smells, noises, and the ever-present problem of cleanliness. However, in the depths of winter, these inconveniences were outweighed by the advantage of warmth. A clucking hen at your feet or a sleepy goat in the corner was a small price to pay for waking up with less of a chill in your bones. It was also a practical solution for those who couldn't afford the luxury of separate buildings or rooms. Every creature in the household played a role in preserving heat. In wealthier households, where animals were typically housed in separate outbuildings or stables, the sharing of warmth took a different form. These families relied more heavily on human companionship to generate heat. Large beds were common in noble homes, and they were often shared by multiple people, not just out of familial closeness but because it was one of the best ways to stay warm through the night. Servants sometimes slept at the foot of their masters' beds, children shared with siblings or nannies, and guest beds often accommodated more than one traveler. This practice was widespread across classes and regions and was viewed through the lens of practicality, not awkwardness. Bed furnishings also played a crucial role. In the absence of heaters or electric blankets, medieval beds were layered with every available form of insulation. Feather beds, woolen blankets, animal pelts, and even thick woven tapestries were all used to create a cocoon of warmth. In some homes, beds had canopies with thick curtains that could be drawn shut at night, trapping body heat and blocking drafts. These enclosed sleeping areas, known as box beds, in some cultures, offered a mini climate-controlled environment. Inside, the temperature could rise a few precious degrees above the surrounding room, a difference that mattered greatly during freezing nights. Some of the most interesting variations in medieval sleeping practices came from monasteries and convents. In these religious communities, monks and nuns often slept in shared dormitories, following strict schedules and austere routines. While they rarely slept with animals, they too relied on human proximity and architectural features to conserve heat. Dormitories were designed with thick walls, small windows, and central corridors to trap warmth. Monastic rules sometimes dictated that blankets be shared or that beds be positioned closely together. In the strictest orders, even in bitter cold, monks were not allowed fires in their sleeping quarters, relying solely on layered robes and the residual heat from their bodies. In some particularly cold climates, unusual practices emerged to make sleeping more bearable. Heated stones, warmed in the hearth, would be wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed before sleeping. These makeshift bed warmers could retain heat for several hours, allowing at least part of the bed to feel toasty during the initial hours of sleep. Wealthier families sometimes used metal or ceramic containers filled with hot coals, early versions of the hot water bottle. These were slid between sheets or under covers with great care, as accidents were known to happen. Burns or singed bedding were not uncommon when these improvised devices were handled poorly. It's worth noting that in many medieval regions, people didn't sleep through the night the way we do now. Instead, segmented sleep was common. People would retire after sundown, sleep for a few hours, then wake during the middle of the night before returning to sleep until morning. That waking period was often spent in quiet reflection, prayer, conversation, or tending the fire. It also presented an opportunity to shift bedding, add layers, or stir up the hearth to rekindle warmth. These brief interruptions in sleep may have helped people stay more in tune with their environment, allowing them to adapt to the cold more fluidly. Children, the elderly, and the infirm were often given priority when it came to bed placement and heat. In families with limited resources, the warmest part of the house, typically nearest the fire, was reserved for those most vulnerable. Babies were swaddled tightly in layers of cloth, and sometimes placed in small cradles near the hearth. Elders might sleep on low benches beside the kitchen or hearth fire, where the warmth was constant, even if the setting wasn't private. This sense of communal care and mutual dependence defined many aspects of medieval home life, especially during the harsh winter months. One might assume that such close quarters and frequent contact with animals would cause concern over hygiene, and while medieval cleanliness didn't resemble modern standards, people were not ignorant of the importance of tidiness. Straw bedding was changed, rushes were swept, and animals were often kept clean to minimize unpleasantness. Still, comfort and survival usually won out over neatness. The balance between warmth and cleanliness was a constant negotiation, shaped by season, region, and resources. The medieval world was not static, and these practices varied widely across time and place. In warmer climates, the need for shared heat was less pronounced. In colder areas, the practices could become more elaborate. In Iceland, for instance, longhouses were designed with a central hearth and sleeping platforms along the walls, covered with furs and lined with insulating turf. In Russia, families built massive masonry stoves that not only cooked their meals but also radiated heat into adjacent rooms, and even beds built directly into the warm wall. In mountainous regions, caves or semi-underground homes were used to trap geothermal warmth. What all these examples share is a deep understanding of the environment and a willingness to adapt. The use of animals for heat, the design of shared sleeping quarters, the layering of bed coverings, and the constant attention to fire management all reflect a practical wisdom born of generations of experience. These weren't simply strange habits. They were survival strategies honed over centuries. As modern people, it's easy to take comfort for granted. With the twist of a knob, warmth floods our homes. With the flip of a switch, electric blankets hummed to life. But the people of the Middle Ages knew a different reality, one where warmth had to be earned, where companionship meant comfort, and where even a sleeping piglet could be a blessing on a cold night. In the next chapter, we'll explore one of the most overlooked but essential tools in the medieval fight against the cold: clothing. From woolen hoods to fur-lined shoes, medieval people wrapped themselves in layers of warmth, as both armor and tradition. Their choices in fabric, fit, and form reveal not just their resourcefulness, but their cultural identities. And some of their techniques may still have value even today. When firewood was scarce and the night spit like sharpened wind, medieval people turned to one of the most trusted methods of staying warm: clothing. But this wasn't fashion as we think of it today. It was function, it was folklore, and it was often very clever. Clothing was not simply about covering one's body. It was a shield against the cold, carefully constructed, layer by layer, from whatever materials were available. And while medieval fashion varied depending on class, region, and climate, one truth held across every barn, hut, monastery, and manor: the more layers you wore, the better your chances of staying warm. Let's start with the base layer, the simple, humble undergarment. For most people, this would be a long linen shirt or chemise, worn next to the skin. Linen might seem like a strange choice for warmth, but it had two valuable properties. First, it helped wick moisture away from the skin, keeping the body drier and therefore less prone to chills. Second, linen was breathable and easy to wash, acting as a kind of buffer between the skin and the woolen outer garments that were harder to clean. Even in the coldest climates, people understood the importance of a good base layer. Over the linen shirt came the main insulating layer, usually made of wool. Wool was the miracle fabric of the Middle Ages. It was durable, plentiful, and most importantly, it retained heat even when damp. Sheep's wool could be spun into thick yarn and woven into cloth, then fashioned into tunics, hose, cloaks, caps, and mittens. Woolen garments were often cut generously to allow for movement and to trap air between layers, which added even more insulation. A woolen tunic or gown could be worn over the linen shirt, with another tunic layered over that if the weather was especially harsh. In colder months, layering was essential. A peasant might wear 2 or 3 tunics at once, while a noble might add a lion's surcoat or a sleeveless overgarment trimmed with fur. Cloaks were fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or tied at the neck, and they varied in length depending on the region and wearer. Longer cloaks provided more warmth, especially when wrapped tightly around the body, but shorter ones allowed for easier movement, especially when working in the fields or preparing food. Many cloaks had hoods attached, offering protection not just for the back and arms, but for the head and neck as well. Speaking of heads, covering the head was a vital part of staying warm. Much of the body's heat is lost through the head, and medieval people were well aware of this long before science proved it. Men often wore coifs, a close-fitting linen or wool cap that tied under the chin. Women might wear veils or wimples, sometimes layered with headbands, caps, or hoods. In colder climates, people added woolen hoods or fur-lined hats, some of which extended into long tails that could be wrapped around the neck like a scarf. The hood and scarf combination, sometimes called a liripipe, became a surprisingly fashionable item in later medieval years, but its origins were purely practical. Hands and feet, being the most exposed and furthest from the body's core warmth, required extra attention. Woolen mittens were common, though gloves with separate fingers were rare and considered luxurious. Peasants might have rough mitts made from felted wool, or even animal hide. In some regions, people wrapped their hands in strips of cloth, like primitive hand warmers. Feet were often tucked into leather boots or shoes, sometimes stuffed with straw, moss, or scraps of cloth to add insulation. Woolen hose, which were essentially long socks that covered the legs, could be pulled up high and tied with garters to keep them from sagging. Layered hose, worn one over the other, offered better protection against the chill, especially in drafty homes with dirt or stone floors. Children were dressed similarly to adults, just in smaller versions of the same garments. Parents knew that keeping little ones warm was a constant battle, and children were often wrapped in extra layers, swaddled tightly, or placed near the fire during the coldest parts of the day. Babies were often dressed in soft linen smocks with woolen wrappings over top, and when taken outside, they might be bundled in fur-lined sacks or carried beneath cloaks for warmth. Fur, though more expensive than wool, was another major source of warmth, especially for the wealthy. Squirrel, rabbit, fox, and marten furs were commonly used in colder climates, and their insulating properties were valued far more than their appearance. Fur was often used to line cloaks, edge collars, and trim sleeves. In noble households, full fur garments might be worn indoors during particularly cold weather. Even in more modest homes, people sometimes repurposed old fur garments into mittens, slippers, or caps. Clothing wasn't just about practicality. It also held meaning and memory. Hand-spun wool from the family sheep, dyed with homemade plant dyes, sewn together by a grandmother or mother, became part of the family's life. Garments were patched, mended, and handed down from one sibling to the next. A particularly warm tunic might become a prized possession, not for its color or shape, but for the comfort it brought during long winter nights. The act of layering up for bed, pulling on an extra cap, wrapping a cloak around one's feet, or tucking warm stones into woolen pouches, became part of the rhythm of daily life. In some monastic communities, clothing was strictly regulated by religious rule. Monks wore robes made from coarse wool, often unlined and unadorned, as a sign of humility. But even within these constraints, there were allowances made during winter. Additional cloaks or cowls could be issued, and monasteries might stockpile woolen socks, mittens, or caps to distribute when the frost set in. Sleeping garments, too, became thicker, though always simple. The shared dormitories and strict routines required a quiet discipline, even in cold weather, but the layering of garments helped the monks endure their frigid cells with stoic calm. For the traveling merchant, soldier, or pilgrim, warmth was an even greater challenge. Long hours on horseback or on foot exposed the traveler to biting winds, sleet, and snow. Their survival depended on clever packing and careful preparation. Woolen leggings, fur-lined boots, heavy cloaks, and tightly wrapped scarves were standard gear. Travelers often carried extra socks or mittens in leather pouches, and some tucked warm coals into portable metal braziers to rest beside when camping. Cloaks were especially valuable because they could double as blankets, tents, or ground coverings in a pinch. Some medieval people even developed personal rituals around dressing for warmth. Before bed, layers were adjusted and checked. Some people wrapped cloth around their heads and mouths to prevent cold air from drying their throats. Others wore caps to sleep, along with multiple pairs of socks. In the morning, garments might be warmed near the fire before being put on, and during the day, cloaks could be rewrapped or shifted to block the wind depending on where the sun lay in the sky. These small habits, repeated day after day, became second nature. Of course, clothing also reflected one's social status. The wealthy had access to fine wool, imported fabrics, dyes, and elaborate tailors. Their winter wardrobes might include velvets, silks, or damasks layered with fur. But even the most luxurious garments served a practical purpose. Nobles still lived in drafty stone halls. Their servants might stoke the fire, but the cold still crept under doorways and lingered in corridors. No amount of wealth could keep the chill entirely at bay, which is why even kings wore thick robes and layered underclothes during the frostiest seasons. Across Europe, regional styles emerged that adapted to the climate. In mountainous areas, people wore shorter tunics with thick woolen leggings for mobility. In wetter regions, cloaks were treated with wax or grease to make them water-resistant. In Scandinavia, Sami herders wore layered reindeer skins, sometimes with the fur turned inward for maximum insulation. In the Alps, people crafted cloaks from thick felt, shaped into bell-like silhouettes that trapped body heat inside. Each culture, each village, each family had its own way of wrapping up against the cold. While layering garments was a practical solution, it also had psychological benefits. Being wrapped in warmth offered not just physical comfort but emotional security. In a world where winter brought uncertainty, poor harvests, illness, isolation, the simple act of bundling up could make one feel safer, cozier, and more connected to the rhythms of home life. Clothes were more than coverings. They were companions against the cold. Perhaps the most remarkable part of medieval winter clothing is how much of it still resonates today. Modern layering techniques, base layers, insulating layers, windproof shells, mirror the medieval logic of dressing in stages. Our winter coats, wool socks, scarves, and gloves are all echoes of those early solutions. And in many parts of the world, traditional winter garments, some centuries old, are still worn today, proving that these medieval techniques were not only creative but enduring. In the next chapter, we'll step away from the wardrobe and into the heart of the home, the hearth. Fireplaces, though humble by today's standards, were the beating heart of medieval warmth. But not all fires were equal, and the way people used, managed, and even feared fire tells us a great deal about how they lived through the coldest months of the year. In the heart of every medieval home, whether large or small, poor or wealthy, urban or rural, one thing remained central and constant: the hearth. It was more than just a fireplace or a place to cook food. It was a source of light, warmth, and community. In a time before electricity, central heating, or even reliable candles, the hearth fire was the beating heart of the home, keeping everyone alive through long, frigid winters. But keeping a fire going was no small task. Unlike the flip of a switch or the click of a lighter today, a medieval fire required careful planning, management, and sometimes a bit of luck. Wood had to be gathered or bought, chopped into usable pieces, dried to prevent smoke, and protected from rain and snow. Fires had to be started with flint, steel, and tinder, or more easily rekindled from the hot coals of the previous night, if those coals had been successfully banked under ashes to preserve their warmth until morning. Banking the fire was an art in itself. Before bed, the fire was gently covered with ashes, cutting off the oxygen supply and slowing the burn. This turned the embers into a smoldering glow that could survive through the night. In the early morning, someone, often a parent or the eldest child, would rise in the cold dark to gently clear away the ashes, blow on the embers, and coax the flame back to life with kindling. If the fire had gone completely out, restarting it meant a cold and smoky chore with flint and tinder. The hearth was rarely just a small decorative feature. In many homes, it was large and open, situated in the center of the room or along the main wall. The most basic hearths were little more than fire pits surrounded by stones or bricks, with an opening above to vent the smoke. In wealthier homes, you might find a stone or brick fireplace built into the wall with a chimney flue to guide the smoke upward and out, though even these early chimneys were primitive and often let in drafts. Smoke was an ever-present part of medieval life. In poorer homes without proper chimneys, it hung in the air like a second ceiling, coating walls, clothing, and even lungs. The roof would often be dark with soot, and windows, if they existed, might be covered in residue. Still, the smoke served secondary purposes. It helped preserve the thatch of the roof by deterring insects and mold. It also dried meats and herbs that hung from beams. Despite the discomfort, people accepted smoke as part of the package, because the warmth and utility of fire outweighed the inconvenience. But warmth from a hearth didn't spread evenly. Most of the heat stayed close to the fire. In homes without insulation or sealed walls, the warmth would dissipate quickly, especially in larger spaces. That's why most family activities, meals, storytelling, sewing, even sleeping, happened as close to the hearth as possible. Furniture was arranged around it, stools pulled up beside the flames, and children often nestled close to the stone edges to soak up what little warmth they could before bed. In castles and noble homes, great halls featured massive hearths large enough to roast whole animals. These enormous fireplaces often had carved mantels and were tended by a staff of servants, whose job it was to keep the fire burning day and night. Even so, the vast stone walls of such buildings made it difficult to heat the entire structure. Corridors and outer rooms remained chilly, and tapestries were hung not just for decoration but to block drafts. Some castles even featured warming rooms, or solar chambers, small areas designed to catch the sun's rays during the day and hold in heat through heavy curtains and close quarters. The fire also shaped daily routines. It dictated when food could be cooked, when people gathered, and even when stories were told. On cold winter evenings, As the light outside faded and candles were still a luxury, the hearth fire became the main source of visibility. People would gather to eat their evening meal around the flames, and then linger, talking, praying, mending clothes, telling tales, or simply enjoying the momentary comfort of warmth. These hours formed the quiet center of daily life, binding the family together through necessity and tradition. Cooking on the hearth was both essential and risky. Open flames meant constant attention. A stew might simmer in a cauldron hung from a metal hook, while flatbread cooked on stones beside the coals. Bread ovens, where they existed, were often built into the hearth or nearby. Some homes used detachable metal grates, spits, or trivets to cook more complex dishes, especially in wealthier households. The warmth from cooking was a welcome bonus. Any fire that fed the family also helped keep them warm. Tools of the hearth were cherished and handed down through generations. Fire irons, pokers, bellows, and tongs were not just functional items, they were part of a daily ritual. Bellows were used to blow oxygen into the coals to intensify the flame. Iron pokers stirred logs and managed ash. Shovels were used to remove burned remnants, and clay pots or brass kettles were kept nearby for water or soup. In some areas, people even warmed metal or stone plates on the fire and placed them under beds at night, primitive space heaters that radiated a bit of comfort. In monasteries and convents, hearths were handled with a slightly different philosophy. Many monastic rules required simplicity and austerity, which meant that fires were carefully regulated. Large communal hearths existed in the kitchen or refectory, but sleeping areas and individual cells were rarely heated. Instead, monks and nuns relied on thick robes, shared dormitories, and spiritual endurance to bear the cold. Some monastic buildings had underfloor heating systems inspired by ancient Roman hypocausts, though these were rare and largely disappeared by the later medieval period. Despite their vital role, fires were treated with a healthy respect, even fear. Accidental blazes were a constant danger in medieval towns and villages, especially where homes were built close together with wooden frames and thatched roofs. A single spark from a hearth could reduce a row of homes to cinders. That's why many villages had strict rules about fire maintenance, requiring people to extinguish or cover their fires at certain hours. Some towns appointed fire watchers or had communal curfews to minimize risk. The fear of uncontrolled fire shaped not only how hearths were used but where they were located and who was allowed to tend them. In rural areas, fire building was considered a crucial skill passed down through generations. Children learned from a young age how to stack wood, gather dry kindling, and strike flint. Superstitions even surrounded the hearth. Some believed that allowing a fire to die completely invited illness or bad luck into the home. Others thought that keeping a hearth warm during childbirth or during a funeral vigil would protect the family from wandering spirits or misfortune. The hearth was not just a practical feature, it was a symbol of life, safety, and continuity. People also used fire to warm food or drink at odd hours. Heated ale, mulled wine, or thick porridge could serve as warming agents from the inside out. A warm cup of spice broth at bedtime was thought to soothe the body and prepare it for sleep. These practices weren't just rooted in comfort. They were shaped by centuries of experience, understanding how to make the most of what little warmth the world had to offer. In places where wood was scarce, people turned to alternative fuels. Peat, a compressed form of plant matter harvested from bogs, was dried and burned as a fuel source in parts of Ireland and Scotland. In forested areas, wood was abundant, but in open plains or highlands, peat and even dried animal dung were used. These materials didn't burn as hot as wood, but they smoldered slowly, providing a steady source of warmth and requiring less frequent tending. Gathering these materials was a seasonal chore, with families stockpiling fuel during the warmer months to prepare for the winter ahead. The design of the hearth also evolved over time. Early medieval hearths were just sunken pits, but as construction techniques improved, raised hearths with chimneys became more common. This allowed better smoke ventilation and more efficient heating. By the late Middle Ages, fireplaces with decorative mantels and brick-lined interiors could be found in wealthier homes. These changes reflected a shift in how people thought about heat, not just as a necessity, but as something that could be controlled, improved, and even made beautiful. Still, no matter how elegant or advanced, every hearth shared the same humble mission: to provide warmth. It was the quiet companion of long winters, the flickering hearth that kept shadows at bay. Families gathered around it, friends shared stories beside it, and generations grew up learning how to keep its flame alive. In a world where the cold could seep into your bones and settle there for months, the hearth was a daily act of defiance against the elements. As we move into the next chapter, we'll explore another unusual method of staying warm, using the architecture itself to trap heat. From turf-roofed homes to bed alcoves built into walls, medieval builders found clever ways to keep the warmth inside and the cold out. Their innovations in home design might just surprise you. When people think about how our ancestors kept warm, they often imagine roaring fires, thick wool cloaks, or huddling close to others. But one of the most underappreciated tools in the medieval fight against winter's chill was architecture itself. Long before insulation, radiators, or double-pane glass, medieval builders used the materials and designs at their disposal to manipulate heat, trapping it, redirecting it, or simply keeping it from vanishing too quickly. In some cases, the way a home was constructed made all the difference between shivering through the night or sleeping in relative comfort. While medieval architecture varied widely across Europe, shaped by geography, available resources, and local traditions, certain patterns emerged wherever winters were harsh. Builders learned that the shape, size, and orientation of a building could affect how well it retained warmth. For instance, small homes with low ceilings were easier to heat because there was less airspace for warmth to escape into. In contrast, larger buildings with high ceilings and open interiors, like castles or cathedrals, could be freezing cold unless special steps were taken to contain or generate heat. The placement of a home also mattered. In many regions, homes were built with their longest side facing the sun, particularly in areas where winters were long and dark. South-facing windows or doors allowed for passive solar heating, catching the low winter sun and letting it shine into living spaces. In mountainous areas, homes were often built into hillsides or partially underground. This helped protect them from wind and used the Earth's natural insulating properties to keep the interior temperature more stable. Even a few degrees of difference could mean a great deal when the wind howled and snow piled up outside. The thickness of walls played a crucial role as well. In wealthier homes or important buildings like monasteries, stone walls could be several feet thick. These heavy walls helped to insulate the interior, keeping it cool in summer and relatively warm in winter. While stone was slow to heat up, once it absorbed warmth from a fire or the sun, it retained that heat longer than wood or plaster. In more modest homes, walls were often made from wattle and daub, a combination of wooden sticks covered in clay, mud, and straw. Though less durable than stone, these materials could be surprisingly effective at insulating when built properly and maintained regularly. Roofs, too, were more than just a way to keep the rain out. Thatched roofs made from reeds or straw were common in rural areas, and while they required maintenance, they offered excellent insulation. The thick layers of tightly packed plant matter trapped warm air inside the house and created a kind of thermal barrier against the cold. Snow would sit on top of the thatch rather than melt right away, adding another layer of protection. In some places, sod or turf was laid over the roof, creating a living green layer that offered additional insulation and wind resistance. These turf roofs, often found in Scandinavia and Iceland, were heavy but effective, so much so that some versions are still used in rural homes today. Inside the home, medieval builders paid attention to how heat moved through a space. One of the cleverest features in northern European homes was the use of built-in sleeping niches, small, enclosed areas often tucked into the wall or elevated above the ground. In some homes, these niches were fitted with wooden doors or curtains, allowing them to be closed off at night. The result was a miniature room within a room, where body heat could build up and stay trapped through the night. In some regions, beds were built over the animal stalls, letting warmth from livestock rise through the floorboards. These design choices may seem rustic, but they show a thoughtful understanding of heat and how it behaves. Curtains weren't just for windows in the medieval world. In many homes, especially among the wealthier classes, heavy fabrics were used as interior dividers. Curtains could be hung around beds, across doorways, or even in front of fireplaces. These served to block drafts, reduce heat loss, and create smaller, more manageable spaces that were easier to warm. In grand homes with multiple rooms, the family might spend most of the winter in a single, solar, or heated chamber, keeping the rest of the house closed off to conserve warmth. Furniture would be moved closer to the fire, and activities would be concentrated in this warm bubble. Windows were both a blessing and a curse when it came to staying warm. Glass was rare and expensive during most of the medieval period, so many homes had simple shutters or cloth coverings instead. Even in wealthier homes that could afford glass, the panes were thin, wavy, and poorly sealed. As a result, windows were often small and placed high on the wall to reduce drafts. In cold weather, they might be covered with oiled parchment, horn, or waxed linen, translucent materials that let in light while blocking the wind. Some people added external shutters that could be closed tightly at night or during storms, further protecting the interior from cold air. Flooring also made a big difference. Stone floors were common in castles and monasteries but were notoriously cold underfoot. In response, people spread thick rushes, straw, or woolen mats across the floor to provide insulation. In wealthier homes, layered carpets or woven tapestries might be used instead. In peasant homes, earthen floors were often compacted and sometimes treated with lime to harden the surface. These floors were swept and refreshed with new straw regularly, helping to keep the ground less icy during winter. The chimney was one of the most important architectural developments for warmth in the later Middle Ages. Before chimneys, smoke simply exited through a hole in the roof, filling the room with haze and losing a great deal of heat in the process. As chimney technology improved, fireplaces became more efficient, and smoke could be directed up and out without losing as much warmth. With better ventilation, people could build fires more safely and keep them going longer, allowing heat to be distributed more effectively throughout the room. Some chimneys were even designed with side flues to allow heat to travel into adjacent rooms or upper floors. In colder climates, whole villages were built with warmth in mind. Narrow streets helped block wind, and buildings were clustered close together so that they could share walls and reduce heat loss. Homes were often connected to barns or storage buildings, so that a person could pass from one structure to another without going outside. In some alpine villages, homes were built directly above animal shelters, using the body heat from livestock as a natural underfloor heater. These designs didn't just make sense, they made life bearable when temperatures dropped below freezing. In cities, public bathhouses and bakeries provided communal sources of warmth. People would gather near these buildings, or even rent space to sleep nearby when the cold was especially intense. In some towns, laws were passed to prevent heat loss, regulating the use of shutters, the spacing of buildings, or the size of fires allowed within homes. Architecture became a form of social cooperation, where everyone's choices about heat and construction affected the comfort and safety of the wider community. Even the way people moved through their homes reflected an understanding of warmth. Doors were kept closed or sealed with fabric to reduce airflow. Heavy wooden doors might be double-layered or lined with fur. Entrances were often built with small vestibules, buffer spaces that reduced the blast of cold air entering the main living area. Stairs were sometimes enclosed with doors or partitions to trap heat on upper floors. Everything from where people slept to how they walked from room to room was influenced by the need to conserve warmth. In religious buildings, architects found creative ways to deal with cold. Stone churches and abbeys were famously hard to heat, but certain features helped. Thick walls, narrow windows, and small side chapels helped trap warmth in certain sections. In some monasteries, hypocaust systems, borrowed from ancient Roman designs, were used to channel warm air under floors or into walls. Though rare, these systems were considered marvels of medieval engineering and were typically reserved for important spaces like scriptoria or infirmaries where monks worked or the sick recovered. Perhaps most impressive of all was how much of this knowledge was passed down through oral tradition and practice, not written blueprints or formal schooling. Families taught one another how to build for warmth, just as they taught cooking, weaving, or farming. A father might teach his son how to position the hearthstone so that the morning sun would strike it. A mother might show her daughter how to weave straw into floor mats for winter. These small, practical decisions added up to homes that were surprisingly adapted to their environments. Today, many of these techniques might seem quaint or outdated, but in recent years, some architects and historians have begun to re-examine medieval building methods for inspiration. In an age of rising energy costs and environmental concerns, the simple wisdom of building with natural insulation, solar orientation, and passive heating strategies is making a quiet comeback. Turf roofs, earthen walls, and window shutters are no longer just relics. They're design choices rooted in centuries of trial, error, and survival. In the next chapter, we'll look at how even the foods people ate played a role in keeping them warm. Certain meals were chosen not just for taste but for their ability to generate heat from the inside out. From thick stews to hot herbal drinks, the medieval kitchen was both a source of comfort and a defense against the cold. These culinary traditions reveal not just how people stayed fed, but how they stayed warm, one bite at a time. In the icy months of the medieval year, when the wind howled through the trees and frost crept across every surface, the kitchen became a haven, not just of nourishment, but of warmth. The meals people cooked, the ingredients they chose, and the ways they prepared their food all played a vital role in keeping their bodies and spirits warm. Medieval cuisine wasn't just about flavor or tradition, it was a survival strategy, carefully tuned to the rhythms of the seasons and the biting demands of winter. To understand how food kept people warm, we must first recognize the limited options that medieval people had. There were no year-round supermarkets, no frozen convenience meals, and no exotic ingredients flown in from warmer climates. Everything eaten during the winter months had to be preserved from the previous harvest, stored carefully, or sourced from local resources. This required a remarkable level of planning and creativity. But despite these limitations, people knew how to turn humble ingredients into meals that fueled the body and chased away the cold. One of the most common and effective forms of winter food was the hearty stew. A bubbling pot hanging over the fire or nestled into the hearthstones was a daily fixture in many homes. These stews were made from whatever was available: root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots, dried peas or beans, bits of preserved meat or bone, and wild herbs collected during warmer months. Everything was tossed together in a single pot, left to simmer for hours, and served steaming hot to every member of the household. The act of eating something warm, thick, and filling helped the body generate heat from the inside out. Porridges and gruels were also common and served a similar purpose. Made from grains like barley, oats, or rye, these dishes were cooked slowly with water or milk until they became soft and thick. Sometimes sweetened with honey, flavored with herbs, or enriched with a splash of broth or fat, porridges provided a warm, comforting meal that was easy to digest and quick to prepare. They were often eaten for breakfast or supper and sometimes served multiple times a day in poorer households. The heat of the porridge itself, combined with its slow-burning carbohydrates, helped keep bellies full and bodies warm. Fat was another important part of the medieval winter diet. While modern diets often emphasize low-fat foods, medieval people valued fat as a dense source of energy and heat. Rendered animal fats, such as lard or tallow, were used for cooking and preserving food. Butter and cheese, when available, were prized not only for their flavor but for their ability to sustain energy through cold, labor-intensive days. In some regions, people even ate suet puddings or dumplings made with flour and fat, boiled directly in the stew pot to soak up both flavor and warmth. In noble and wealthy households, winter feasts included richer fare, roasted game, spiced wine, custards, and meat pies served in heavily insulated halls. While such extravagance was out of reach for the average villager, the underlying principle was the same. Rich foods helped generate internal warmth and gave the body fuel to endure long, dark winters. Spices like ginger, cinnamon, and cloves, imported at great cost, were believed to heat the body from within and were used generously in winter dishes and drinks. One of the most cherished comforts in medieval winter life was the warm drink. Hot beverages were often simple: a mug of warmed ale, a thin broth, a tea brewed from herbs like sage, thyme, or chamomile. Mulled wine, simmered with spices and sweetened with honey, was served during holidays and special occasions. In monasteries and noble courts, hot almond milk, a mix of ground almonds, water, and warming spices, was consumed as both a drink and a sauce for bread or porridge. These warm liquids provided hydration, nutrition, and a deeply comforting sensation, especially when the air outside stung with cold. Bread remained a staple year-round, but in winter, it took on new significance. Thick slices of bread were toasted near the fire, soaked in broth, or served with hot toppings to add warmth to every meal. In some regions, stale bread was used as a base for trencher meals, where stews or gravies were poured on top of the bread, softening it into a hot, savory dish. Bread pudding, a mix of bread, milk, eggs, and spices, could be baked in clay ovens or pots and served warm as a filling treat. The use of bread as both ingredient and vessel helped ensure that no crumb went to waste. Preserved foods, too, were central to winter eating. Root cellars and cool storage rooms were stocked with barrels of pickled vegetables, dried beans, salted meat, and smoked fish. These preserved ingredients could be rehydrated and cooked into hot meals that brought life to the dull days of winter. Even the process of preparing these meals, soaking dried legumes, chopping preserved roots, heating salted fish, became part of the comforting routine that brought warmth to the home. The act of cooking itself contributed to household heat. In smaller homes, the warmth from a day-long stew or a busy baking session could make a real difference in the overall temperature. Families often planned meals that required long cooking times, not only to tenderize tough ingredients, but to benefit from the ambient warmth of the fire. Some people deliberately cooked in shifts, starting breakfast early to warm the house, preparing lunch to keep the fire going, and finishing with supper as the day drew to a close. These culinary rhythms provided not just food, but sustained warmth from dawn to dusk. In colder regions, meals were often designed around how long they could stay warm. Clay pots or wooden bowls with lids helped keep food hot even after it left the hearth. In wealthier homes, metal serving dishes or heated plates were used during meals. In rural cottages, people sat close to the fire during supper, holding bowls in their laps and wrapping their hands around mugs to soak up the warmth. Even mealtimes were arranged around the cold, with families gathering during the warmest part of the day or directly after cooking, when the hearth was at its peak. Holiday meals, often centered around the winter solstice or religious festivals like Christmas or Epiphany, were moments of both spiritual joy and physical relief. These feasts featured rare treats, dried fruits, sweetened pastries, roasted birds, and spiced drinks that broke the monotony of the winter diet. More importantly, they gave people something to look forward to in the bleakest months of the year. Sharing a warm meal in good company, surrounded by firelight and laughter, was one of the most enduring and effective ways to fight the cold, not just physically, but emotionally. Children, elders, and the sick were often given warm food first, or special meals designed to keep them healthy during winter. Thin broths for those with sensitive stomachs, thick porridges for growing children, and warming herbal teas for the elderly were all part of medieval home care. Mothers kept pots simmering throughout the day, so that warm food could be offered to family members as needed. These meals were more than sustenance. They were expressions of care and protection. In religious communities, food and warmth were closely tied to spiritual practice. Monks and nuns often fasted during certain seasons, but even then, the kitchens provided simple hot foods to maintain strength. A warm bowl of lentil stew, a piece of hot bread, or a cup of boiled herb water served with reverence became a reminder of balance between physical need and spiritual discipline. Hospitality was sacred, and visitors to monasteries were often greeted with warm meals and a seat near the fire. Even the way people stored and prepared ingredients reflected the season's demands. Grains were ground in winter to prepare flour for hearty bread and thickening stews. Dried herbs were crushed and mixed into warming spice blends. Apples, onions, and cabbages were preserved in barrels or buried in straw to keep them from freezing. These simple but thoughtful strategies ensured that even as snow blanketed the ground and the fields lay fallow, kitchens remained alive with the smells and steam of home-cooked warmth. Folk traditions also influenced winter food. Some regions believed that certain ingredients had warming properties, like garlic, mustard, and black pepper, and added them liberally to dishes during the colder months. Superstitions held that eating certain foods on specific days would protect against illness or ensure good fortune. Hot cider was sometimes brewed and left on the hearth as a blessing for the home. These small rituals, passed down from generation to generation, gave meals a deeper meaning and reminded families that warmth was not just about temperature. It was about tradition, togetherness, and belief. Today, we still find echoes of these medieval strategies in our own winter habits. We gather around holiday tables, sip warm drinks, and turn to comfort foods when the cold creeps in. The steaming bowl of soup on a snowy day, the mug of tea before bed, the joy of baking something fragrant and hot, all of it has roots in centuries of wisdom, shaped by people who knew how to keep warm with little more than fire, food, and love. In the next chapter, we'll journey beyond the walls of the home and into the communal world, exploring how people found warmth in public spaces, churches, guild halls, and gathering places. Even in a time of limited resources, medieval communities discovered that sometimes, the best way to stay warm was to stay together. While much of medieval life revolved around the home, warmth was not always something that could be found within one's own four walls. In fact, some of the most effective, and sometimes overlooked, ways people stayed warm involved stepping outside the home and into the warmth of the community. Whether it was gathering in a bustling guild hall, attending early morning mass in a crowded chapel, or taking refuge in a busy marketplace, medieval people knew that in the coldest moments, shared space often meant shared heat. Communal living wasn't just a feature of the Middle Ages, it was a form of survival. Villages and towns in medieval Europe were often constructed with cold weather in mind. Buildings were clustered close together, not only to conserve space but also to shelter one another from wind. Narrow streets, high walls, and connected rooftops acted like a buffer against the elements. In places like England, France, and the Low Countries, entire rows of homes were built as continuous structures. These shared walls helped retain internal warmth. If one house had a fire going, some of that heat naturally radiated through to the neighboring space. People didn't just live beside each other for convenience. They were part of a heating network, whether they realized it or not. In smaller villages, the warmth of neighbors played an even more direct role. It was common for friends or extended family to spend cold evenings together in a single home, especially if that home had the largest hearth or the best stockpile of firewood. People shared food, firelight, and conversation. Storytelling, singing, or working on small crafts became ways to pass the time and distract from the bitter temperatures. Children huddled together under shared blankets while adults gathered on benches or stools near the fire, exchanging local news or helping with tasks like spinning, mending, or preparing herbs. The concept of community warmth was also seen in religious life. Churches and chapels, while often large and drafty, offered a different kind of shelter. On feast days and Sundays, the congregation's shared body heat could make the building surprisingly warm, even in the absence of a roaring fire. People dressed in their thickest layers, and priests wore vestments designed to insulate. For some villagers, attending a long winter service wasn't just a spiritual duty, it was a welcome opportunity to thaw out their hands and feet. The warmth of collective faith, sung hymns, and candlelight helped many endure the season's hardships. In monastic settings, communal living was taken to a different level. Monks and nuns lived, worked, and prayed in shared spaces, often following strict daily routines that aligned with the movement of the sun and the demands of the season. While their dormitories were cold and their cells even colder, monasteries usually had specific rooms designated for warmth. The kale factory, or warming room, was one such space, a small chamber with a fire that monks could visit to warm themselves between prayers or before meals. These rooms were kept simple and quiet, their warmth a practical blessing rather than a luxury. Markets and guild halls provided another source of warmth for townspeople. Even in freezing temperatures, towns held regular market days, and the crush of bodies in a small square or hall created surprising warmth. Vendors sold hot food and drink, helping to keep themselves and their customers comfortable. Blacksmiths, bakers, and other craftspeople worked beside open flames or ovens, which naturally drew people in. In the colder months, spending time at the blacksmith's forge wasn't just for shoeing horses. It was a chance to warm your hands and hear the local gossip. Guild halls, meeting places for tradespeople and craftsmen, also became winter refuges. Members would gather to conduct business, share meals, or work on communal projects. These halls often had their own hearths and stored firewood for winter use. For apprentices and journeymen, the opportunity to spend cold days indoors learning from a master or working on goods meant not only job security but comfort. Guilds recognized the importance of mutual support, and that included making sure members had places to stay warm during the harshest parts of the year. Schools and universities, while rare and mostly reserved for wealthier boys, also had methods of coping with the cold. In monastery-run schools, children studied by firelight when possible, sitting close together on benches and sharing blankets or cloaks. In cities like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna, university students lived in communal lodgings or colleges with shared dining halls and study rooms. While these buildings were often drafty, the presence of other students made them warmer, and meals served in group settings helped stave off the winter chill. In homes of the wealthy, communal warmth was often found among servants and household staff. In the service quarters, workers cooked, cleaned, and maintained the estate, often in tight spaces where fires burned continuously for baking, brewing, or heating water. These workspaces became unexpected centers of warmth. Kitchen staff, stable boys, and laundry workers would gather in these warm zones, not just to do their duties but to share warmth during breaks. Even in castles, it was often the servants' quarters, rather than the lord's chambers, that held the steadiest heat throughout the day. Festivals and gatherings also served as bright spots in winter's gloom. Celebrations like Yule, Twelfth Night, and Candlemas were excuses for feasting, dancing, and shared merriment. Fires were lit in public squares, torches carried through town streets, and candles burned in windows as symbols of light and warmth. Community members brought food to share, musicians played in cozy corners, and laughter echoed in stone halls or timber-framed inns. Even short-lived warmth could make the cold more bearable, and people treasured the sense of togetherness these events brought. Inns and taverns offered more than food and drink. They were often the warmest public buildings in town. Travelers, merchants, and villagers gathered in the common room, where a large hearth or stove kept the chill at bay. Patrons sat shoulder to shoulder on benches, not just to chat but to absorb the heat that pooled near the fire. Rooms upstairs might be cold, but the bustling activity below provided both a physical and emotional warmth. Songs were sung, dice thrown, and stories told, all part of the medieval rhythm of warmth and fellowship. In some areas, bathhouses were still in operation, though they varied widely depending on local culture and religious views. Where permitted, these bathhouses provided hot water, steam, and heated rooms, a rare luxury for the common person. People would soak, relax, and socialize in the warmth, often lingering as long as they could afford. In regions influenced by Roman or Islamic traditions, bathhouses were more common and included complex heating systems that distributed warm air beneath the floor or through pipes in the walls. For many, the bathhouse was not only a place of cleanliness but a rare moment of peaceful warmth. Warming each other physically was just one part of the communal experience. The psychological comfort of being together mattered too. Sharing a space, sharing a story, sharing food, all of these things reminded people that they weren't alone in their struggle against the cold. The hum of conversation, the rhythm of shared work, and the gentle sound of others breathing nearby helped ease the burdens of winter. People instinctively sought out company when the days were shortest and the nights coldest, reinforcing bonds that would carry them through the harshest times. Even in remote areas, communal efforts kept people warm. Villagers organized woodcutting parties, where families would gather to chop firewood together before the first snow. These events were productive but also social. Children played nearby, mothers prepared food, and the resulting stockpile of wood was divided among households. In some communities, shared ovens were built for baking, allowing several families to take turns using the fire and saving precious fuel. These cooperative practices helped conserve resources and ensured that no one faced the cold entirely alone. Some medieval towns developed systems of charity and care for the elderly, widows, or the sick during winter. Churches and guilds provided alms, food, or access to heated rooms. Wealthier citizens sometimes donated fuel or warm clothing. In some regions, the custom of keeping a fire for the poor was maintained by noble households, where a designated hearth burned continuously, and the needy could come to warm themselves during daylight hours. These acts of communal care reflected a broader understanding that warmth, like food and shelter, was a basic human need that should be shared. While many of these practices may seem like relics of the past, they carry timeless wisdom. In our modern world, full of central heating and personal space, we sometimes forget the power of shared warmth. But there's something deeply human about gathering in close quarters, about talking beside a fire, about wrapping one blanket around two sets of shoulders. These medieval customs remind us that warmth is not just about temperature, it's about connection. In the next chapter, we'll look at some of the strangest items ever used to retain heat, from heated stones in the bed to foot warmers and hot brick cradles. These low-tech gadgets and creative hacks were surprisingly effective, and they revealed just how resourceful people became when faced with long winters and freezing nights. In the absence of modern heating technology, the people of the Middle Ages turned to ingenuity to stay warm, especially at night, when temperatures dropped and the hearth fire slowly died down. Beyond layering clothing, gathering around fires, or sharing space with animals, medieval families developed a surprising collection of practical, low-tech tools and warming gadgets. These clever contraptions, ranging from glowing bricks to heated trays, became essential parts of the household, passed down through generations and adapted for centuries. While none of these methods could rival the comfort of a modern radiator, they played a crucial role in fighting off the cold and helping families rest, work, and survive with a little more comfort. One of the most enduring and widespread tools was the heated stone. This simple yet effective solution was used in homes across Europe. A flat or rounded stone, often about the size of a loaf of bread, was placed directly in or near the fire until it became thoroughly warmed. Once it was glowing hot, but not dangerously so, it was carefully removed with tongs or thick cloth, wrapped in rags or burlap, and carried to bed. There, it might be placed at the foot of the mattress, tucked beneath blankets, or even laid beside the sleeper like a primitive hot water bottle. The heat it radiated was slow and steady, and though it faded within an hour or two, it was enough to help someone fall asleep without freezing toes. Some households used bricks or ceramic tiles in the same way. These were a bit more refined and easier to handle than loose stones. In wealthier homes, there were even specially made bed warmers, ceramic or metal containers designed to be filled with embers or hot coals. These were placed inside the bed before sleep, moved around to warm the sheets, and then removed to prevent burns or danger. Some designs included small feet so the container could sit evenly on the bed or floor without tipping. Others had long handles, allowing the user to slide them between the sheets and back out again. These bed warmers became so popular that they were eventually decorated with engravings or inscriptions, turning them from plain utility items into family keepsakes. In some regions, people went one step further and used warming pans. These were shallow metal pans, usually made of brass or copper, with a lid and a long handle. Filled with hot coals from the hearth, the warming pan was slid between the bedsheets in slow, sweeping motions to heat the entire surface. It required care and attention. Coals were not without risk, and the metal could become dangerously hot. Inexperienced users could scorch the sheets or, in rare cases, cause small fires. Still, when used properly, warming pans provided a luxurious burst of heat and were considered a sign of modest affluence in many homes. Another useful item was the foot warmer. Much like today's space heaters or electric pads, these small boxes, made of wood or metal, were filled with hot coals and placed near the feet while sitting or sleeping. Often lined with perforated lids or slanted tops to let out the warmth while containing the coals safely, foot warmers were particularly common in churches, marketplaces, and schools. In colder climates, people brought them along to public gatherings or placed them in carriages when traveling. Some designs even included a fabric covering or fur lining to keep the warmth trapped inside longer. For those who worked long hours sitting at a spinning wheel or writing desk, a foot warmer was an essential winter companion. In homes where the bed was not raised off the floor, particularly among peasants, another unusual tool was the warming cradle, used primarily for infants or the elderly. This could be as simple as a basket lined with warm stones or cloth, placed near the fire and covered with additional blankets. In wealthier homes, cradles were fitted with compartments beneath the baby's bed to hold a warm tile or brick, offering gentle, radiant heat through the night. The goal wasn't just comfort, it was safety. Babies and the elderly were more vulnerable to cold, and these devices helped prevent chill-related ailments. Hot cloth wraps were another creative solution. Strips of wool or linen were heated near the fire, then wrapped around joints, arms, or legs to ease stiffness and warm the skin. These wraps were often used by older adults or those recovering from illness. In colder towns, bathhouses even provided these cloths as part of their service, dampened with hot water, wrung out, and gently pressed against the skin. Some were soaked in herbal infusions thought to increase warmth and circulation. While they didn't last long, the warmth they provided was immediate and soothing. In addition to warming the body, medieval people also created tools to keep their hands warm while working. One popular device was the hand warmer pot, a small ceramic or metal container with a central cavity for hot coals or heated stones. The user would grip the pot, warming their hands without the need to be next to a fire. This was especially useful in unheated spaces such as barns, market stalls, or cold stone rooms. In colder monasteries, monks copied texts with one hand while holding a hand warmer in the other. These portable heaters became common accessories in winter, sometimes with decorative holes for venting and carrying straps for convenience. A particularly fascinating invention was the warming bench or chair, a piece of furniture built with heating in mind. In wealthier households or communal buildings like inns and guildhalls, some benches were constructed with hollow spaces beneath the seat to hold warmed stones or coals. The idea was to sit above a slow, radiating heat source that could keep the entire body warmer while remaining seated. These benches were placed near fireplaces or against thick interior walls to maximize warmth. In rare cases, high-backed wooden chairs were also built to trap and reflect heat toward the occupant, functioning like a personal cocoon of warmth. The role of the kitchen oven should not be overlooked either. In homes that had them, especially in the later medieval period, the oven often remained warm long after baking was finished. People would open the door slightly to let the heat escape into the room, or place wrapped stones inside to heat them up before bedtime. In some towns, communal bread ovens served multiple families, and the residual warmth from a baking session could be used to heat nearby rooms or even dry clothing. Children sometimes sat near the oven wall while their parents worked, absorbing the comfort of the heated stones without getting too close to the open flames. Aside from physical tools, people also relied on rituals and routines that enhanced warmth. For example, families often heated beds in sequence, sending children to bed first so their body heat would warm the space for others. This strategy worked well in households where multiple people shared a bed, allowing each person to benefit from the residual heat of the previous occupant. Blankets and mattresses were also fluffed or shaken out near the hearth before sleep, increasing their insulation by adding pockets of warm air between the layers. Layered bedding was itself a kind of tool. Mattresses were often made of straw, feathers, or wool, and laid atop wooden frames or rope supports. Above the sleeper came multiple layers, woolen sheets, animal hides, quilts, and in some cases, heavy tapestries or curtains draped around the entire bed. These layers trapped body heat and created a microclimate that helped the sleeper endure the night. In wealthier homes, four-poster beds with curtains could be closed like a tent to block drafts and keep in the heat. Even the placement of the bed mattered. It was often positioned away from windows and outer walls, close to interior chimneys or thickly insulated areas of the house. Some lesser-known techniques were surprisingly effective despite their simplicity. For instance, hollowed logs filled with hot sand were used in a few northern regions as stationary heat sources. People would gather near these logs, sometimes seated on top of them, with thick blankets between their bodies and the wood. In other cases, dried beans or peas were heated and placed in cloth pouches, used as reusable heating pads. These methods may seem unusual today, but they demonstrate the same logic that underpins many modern solutions, using stored heat and materials at hand to create comfort. It's easy to underestimate how powerful these simple tools were in their time. Without electricity or modern insulation, the medieval world demanded creativity. Each of these objects, stones, bricks, pans, and wraps, offered a slice of warmth in a world that could be painfully cold. More importantly, they represented the daily resilience of people who understood their environment deeply and worked with it, not against it. Many of these tools and techniques were passed down through generations, refined and adjusted as new materials became available. Some evolved into the early designs of stoves and hot water bottles. Others faded with the rise of industrial heating. But in cottages, monasteries, and manors across Europe, the legacy of these warmers lives on, not only in museum collections or historical records, but in the everyday comfort practices we still use today. In the next chapter, we'll explore the role of textiles, not just clothing, but the fabrics that lined walls, hung from ceilings, and layered beds. Medieval people didn't just wear warmth, they hung it, wrapped it, and wove it into every corner of their homes. The textures of warmth were as important as the temperature itself. In a world where insulation was nearly non-existent and winter winds slipped through every crack and crevice, warmth in a medieval home often came not just from the fire or layers of clothing, but from the very fabric woven into everyday life, literally. Textiles, in all their forms, played a powerful role in medieval domestic comfort. They were hung, draped, wrapped, stuffed, and stitched with intention. These fabrics were more than decoration. They were functional tools, each chosen and used with an eye toward survival in the coldest seasons. From heavy woolen wall hangings to feather-filled quilts, the medieval home was a patchwork of warmth made by hand and passed from one generation to the next. Let's begin with one of the most overlooked but essential uses of textiles: tapestries. In modern times, we tend to think of tapestries as ornate wall art reserved for castles or cathedrals, but in the Middle Ages, they served a much more practical purpose. Tapestries were thick, woven pieces of fabric, often made of wool and sometimes embroidered with decorative patterns, that were hung on the walls of stone buildings. These walls, while sturdy and protective, were ice-cold in winter and allowed cold air to seep through the seams and mortar. By hanging heavy fabrics over them, families created a layer of insulation, softening both the temperature and the acoustics of a room. In wealthy homes, these wall hangings might depict scenes from folklore or religion. In simpler households, they were plain or patterned, their value lying more in warmth than artistry. Even canopy beds, a staple of medieval bedrooms, were built with warmth in mind. The four-poster bed wasn't just a status symbol, it was a clever solution to the cold. Curtains could be drawn around all sides of the bed, trapping the sleeper's body heat and creating a miniature room within a room. Inside these textile walls, the temperature could rise noticeably compared to the rest of the room. The mattress, often made of straw, wool, or feathers, sat atop rope or wooden slats and was layered with linens, quilts, and animal hides. The canopy overhead helped block drafts that slipped through the ceilings or rafters, and the drapes below ensured that cold air from the floor stayed where it belonged, beneath the bed. In less affluent homes, people made do with simpler but still effective alternatives. Families used wall cloths, essentially large sheets of heavy fabric, sometimes even repurposed cloaks or old garments, pinned or nailed to walls. These hung loosely to allow air to circulate behind them and reduce condensation, while still cutting the bite of the wind. Some families used reed mats or felted wool panels, especially in Northern Europe, where the winters were particularly severe. The goal was always the same: to create a fabric barrier between the people inside and the cold world beyond their walls. Curtains weren't limited to beds and walls. They were used across doorways too. In medieval homes, the front door was often a major source of drafts. Thick fabric curtains, sometimes double-layered and weighted at the bottom, were hung across the inside of exterior doors. When someone entered or exited, the curtain was pushed aside and quickly drawn back across the opening. In homes with more than one room, internal doors might also have curtains instead of wooden barriers, especially in cottages or peasant dwellings where proper doors were too expensive or cumbersome. These fabric partitions helped retain heat in specific areas, especially the central living space where the hearth was located. Even ceilings were sometimes treated with textiles. In larger halls or upstairs bedrooms with exposed beams, fabric was hung from the rafters to create a soft overhead canopy that trapped warm air below. These ceiling cloths were usually made from linen or wool and dyed dark colors to absorb light and heat. Some were temporary installations for winter months only, while others were left in place year-round, growing heavier and darker with the soot and smoke of daily life. Though few survive today, these overhead fabrics were a hallmark of creative medieval warmth. On the floor, textiles offered insulation from the cold ground. Rushes, straw, or reeds were commonly spread across floors, but in wealthier homes, these were layered with wool rugs or woven mats. In some cases, old cloaks or scraps of cloth were used as rugs, especially near beds or fireplaces. These provided both physical and psychological comfort, softening the hardness of stone or packed earth and adding a sense of warmth to a room that might otherwise feel barren. In households where fabric was scarce, people might instead use fur or sheepskin, laid near sleeping areas or sitting spots, offering both cushion and heat. Blankets and bedding were another essential use of textiles. The word blanket itself likely originates from the French word blanchet, meaning white woolen cloth. In the Middle Ages, blankets were typically woven from wool, thick, durable, and capable of holding warmth even when damp. Homespun blankets were prized possessions, often passed down in families, repaired year after year until they were more patched than original fabric. A well-maintained blanket could last decades and might be lined with linen or stitched with embroidery as both a decorative and sentimental gesture. Above the blankets came quilts, textiles made by stitching together layers of fabric with wool, feathers, or even straw as filler. Quilts were less common among peasants but were treasured in middle-class or wealthy homes. A good quilt was not only warm but heavy, pressing down on the sleeper like a protective cocoon. Some quilts were made specifically for children or the elderly, designed to be wrapped tightly or folded double for extra insulation. In particularly cold areas, multiple quilts might be stacked together, creating a deep, nest-like bed where one could burrow and find comfort despite the bitter cold outside. Sheepskins, rabbit furs, and other animal hides were commonly used in bedding, especially where fabric was hard to come by. These materials offered superior insulation and were used either beneath or above the sleeper. In monasteries, animal skins were sometimes issued during winter fasts, allowing monks to endure the cold with a minimum of comfort. In peasant homes, the family might sleep beneath a mix of woven wool, old tunics, and hides stitched into crude but effective blankets. The aim was always the same: to trap as much warmth as possible and avoid waking up with frozen fingers or stiff joints. Textiles even followed people outside the home, where cloaks, capes, and mantles were made with warmth in mind. But even inside, personal wraps and house shawls were common. A person might throw a thick piece of wool over their shoulders while sitting near the fire or carry it around the home as they moved between chores. In households without interior heating, this mobility of warmth was critical. Rather than heating the whole house, families heated the person. This philosophy is one that continues in cold cultures even today. Why warm the room when you can wrap yourself? The crafting of these textiles was an important part of family life. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were essential skills, especially for women, who often produced most of the household's fabric needs by hand. Wool from sheep was carded, spun into yarn, dyed with plant-based pigments, and woven into cloth on home looms. The process was time-consuming, but it allowed families to control the weight, texture, and purpose of the fabrics they used. Heavier weaves were set aside for winter, while finer linens were used in warmer months or for layering beneath rougher wool. In wealthier homes, servants or professional tailors might handle the work, but the relationship between cloth and warmth remained deeply personal across all classes. Even the colors of textiles held meaning. Darker colors absorbed more light and heat, making them preferable in cold seasons. Browns, reds, and deep blues were common choices for winter curtains or blankets. In some households, seasonal cloths were rotated throughout the year, lighter fabrics in summer, heavier in winter. These seasonal changes were small but impactful, helping families feel attuned to the natural world while also staying comfortable. In addition to their practical value, textiles offered emotional warmth. A blanket made by a mother's hand, a curtain embroidered with family initials, or a tapestry gifted for a wedding served not only to warm the body, but also to comfort the spirit. Textiles carried stories, held memories, and marked life events. They were repaired with care, folded with pride, and displayed with reverence. In times of scarcity, when food and firewood were limited, the presence of soft, warm cloth could make a home feel secure, even joyful, in the middle of the harshest winter. Textiles were even used as gifts of compassion. In some communities, neighbors brought spare blankets or cloaks to widows, new mothers, or the sick. Churches collected woolen cloth to distribute during winter, and monasteries maintained stores of extra bedding for travelers or those in need. The act of giving warmth was symbolic, a gesture of kindness that echoed across centuries. To offer someone a blanket or shawl was to offer more than comfort. It was to share your own protection from the cold. Today, many of the textile practices of the Middle Ages have faded or been mechanized, but their legacy remains. We still layer curtains in winter, wrap ourselves in quilts, and seek warmth in the tactile softness of fabric. The logic of using cloth to insulate our bodies and homes is as relevant now as it was 1,000 years ago. And in many ways, our modern comforts are rooted in the knowledge of those who, without the tools of our time, learned to make warmth with their hands and hearts. In the next chapter, we'll look at how medieval people understood warmth and cold through the lens of belief, superstition, and medicine. From balancing hot and cold humors to warding off winter spirits, the Middle Ages were filled with strange and fascinating ideas about how to stay warm, and what happened if you didn't. In the Middle Ages, warmth and cold were not merely physical sensations, they were woven into the very fabric of how people understood the body, the soul, and the world around them. Staying warm wasn't just about building a fire or wearing wool, it was a matter of balance, health, and even moral strength. People believed that too much cold, or even the wrong kind of cold, could throw off the body's natural harmony, invite illness, or disturb the spirit. As a result, many of the choices people made about heating, dressing, and eating were influenced by beliefs that may seem curious now, but which made perfect sense within their worldview. These ideas didn't just affect the elite or the educated, they shaped the everyday actions of villagers, mothers, monks, and healers alike. At the heart of medieval health and medicine was the theory of the four humors, a concept that had been passed down from ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. According to this theory, the human body was governed by four basic fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with specific qualities: hot or cold, wet or dry, and good health depended on keeping them in balance. A person with too much cold and wet phlegm, for example, might suffer from sluggishness or respiratory issues. In the winter, the cold and damp weather was thought to increase the influence of this humor, making people more prone to illness. To counteract this, they needed to consume hot, dry foods and surround themselves with warming influences. This belief filtered into countless daily decisions. It wasn't uncommon for someone to select their meals, clothing, or sleeping arrangements based on how hot or cold their constitution was perceived to be. For instance, someone considered naturally cold and moist, perhaps due to a pale complexion or a soft-spoken demeanor, might be advised to avoid cold foods and dress in extra layers, even indoors. A person thought to have a hot and dry temperament might be encouraged to moderate their activity during winter, to prevent overheating and imbalance in contrast to the cold weather. These ideas weren't seen as superstition, they were considered scientific truth. This system also influenced what people believed about cold air. Unlike today, when fresh air is associated with health, medieval thinkers often believed that cold or damp air could be dangerous, even poisonous. The term, miasma, was used to describe harmful air, especially air thought to carry disease. Miasmas were believed to rise from decaying matter, swamps, or stagnant water, and they were more feared in the cold months, when smoke, fog, and foul odors lingered. To protect against this, people burned herbs like rosemary or lavender, not just for fragrance but to purify the air. In wealthier homes, pomanders, small balls filled with fragrant spices, were carried or hung near beds to ward off the harmful chill. There was also a widespread belief that drafts, even small ones, could be the source of serious illness. Sitting near a window or walking past an open door in winter was avoided whenever possible. In some households, people blocked keyholes with wax or fabric, not just for warmth but to stop bad air from slipping in. While we now know that germs, not air itself, cause illness, these practices reflected a keen awareness of environmental exposure. In a world without antibiotics or modern hospitals, prevention was everything. Herbalists and folk healers offered their own interpretations of warmth and health. Many herbs were categorized by their warming or cooling effects on the body. Ginger, cinnamon, peppermint, and mustard were considered hot, and were used in both food and medicine during winter months. These were added to teas, stews, or poultices to stimulate internal heat, relieve sluggishness, or protect against chills. Other practices included rubbing warming salves on joints, wrapping the feet in heated cloths steeped in herbal infusions, or placing aromatic bundles beneath pillows to soothe breathing and encourage restful, warming sleep. Even emotions were believed to influence bodily heat. A joyful person, full of laughter and good cheer, was thought to possess internal warmth, which strengthened the body against winter ailments. On the other hand, sorrow, fear, or anger could chill the body or upset its balance. During the dark months of winter, families made extra efforts to keep spirits high, not just for happiness, but for health. Music, games, storytelling, and feasting were seen not only as pleasures, but as preventive measures against the creeping cold, both physical and emotional. Many families kept small home remedies for combating cold. For sore throats, a popular treatment was warm milk mixed with honey and a dash of spice. For cold limbs, a poultice made of mashed onions, mustard seeds, or horseradish might be wrapped in cloth and laid over the skin. Heated stones wrapped in herbs were placed under blankets to warm the chest or belly. These treatments weren't just about warmth, they were about restoring the body's proper flow, realigning its internal temperature with the outer world. Dreams and superstitions also played a part. Some people believed that sleeping in a cold room without covering one's head could invite bad dreams, spirits, or illness. To prevent this, nightcaps were worn not just for comfort, but as protection. Others avoided sleeping with their feet toward a door or window, fearing that cold air, or something less natural, might enter the room and pull away warmth during sleep. In rural areas, charms were hung near beds to ward off cold-related misfortune, such as sudden illness or loss of energy. These weren't viewed as strange or magical, but simply as wise precautions. In religious communities, warmth was tied to spiritual discipline. Some monastic orders saw the cold as a tool for purification and endurance. Monks were expected to wake before dawn, pray in unheated chapels, and endure winter's chill as a form of spiritual refinement. Yet even within these strict routines, some accommodations were made. Additional cloaks or blankets were provided during the harshest months, and warming rooms, though rarely luxurious, offered a place for brothers to recover after long vigils or icy morning walks. Warmth was seen as a balance between worldly comfort and spiritual focus. Weather patterns themselves were interpreted through a spiritual lens. A particularly cold winter might be seen as a test from heaven or a punishment for sin. Prayers for mild weather were offered in church services, and saints known for healing or weather control were invoked. Saint Medard, Saint Swithin, and Saint Scholastica were among the figures commonly prayed to for protection against storms or frost. Candlemas, celebrated in early February, was seen as a turning point in the season, and many weather superstitions grew around it. A sunny Candlemas, for example, was thought to predict a longer winter, similar to the modern groundhog legend. Even architecture reflected these beliefs. As mentioned in earlier chapters, some homes were designed with small alcoves for icons or blessed candles. These sacred spaces, though spiritual in intent, also served a practical purpose. A lit candle in a small room provided not only light but a touch of warmth. Some families believe that keeping a candle burning overnight, especially one blessed during Candlemas, offered both protection and heat, guarding against the spiritual and physical chill of winter. These layered beliefs, while strange to modern thinking, reveal a deep and thoughtful connection to the natural world. Medieval people didn't have scientific thermometers or weather forecasts. They couldn't explain temperature in terms of degrees or insulation values. But they paid close attention to the rhythms of their bodies and the world around them. They noticed that certain foods made them feel better in the cold, that laughter eased aches, that fresh rushes or herbs improved sleep. They watched the skies, noted how animals behaved before a storm, and listened to the creak of timbers in a freezing house. In their own way, they were scientists, just of a different sort. These beliefs were passed down through generations, not always written in books, but shared through stories, songs, and daily practice. A grandmother might teach her grandchild which herbs to use on cold feet. A father might show his son how to bank the fire just right to keep the coals glowing until morning. A neighbor might bring a bundle of dried lavender, for luck and warmth, when visiting during winter. These small gestures built a culture of care, one that was rich in meaning even when short on resources. Today, many of these practices and beliefs have faded, replaced by electric blankets and thermostats. But some still linger, like sipping warm tea when you're feeling low, pulling on fuzzy socks for comfort, or lighting a candle on a stormy night. These actions might seem modern, but they echo a history of human effort to stay warm, not just in body, but in spirit. In the next chapter, we'll return to the humble hearth and explore how medieval people kept their fire alive through the night, using ashes, coals, and clever tricks to preserve heat when they needed it most. It was a delicate balance of science and tradition, and one of the most important routines in every home. In the medieval world, warmth wasn't something taken for granted. It had to be built, maintained, and, most importantly, preserved. Among all the daily responsibilities in a medieval household, few were as vital or carefully observed as tending to the hearth fire. As daylight faded and the chill of night crept in, families across Europe performed the same quiet ritual, preparing their hearths so that it would continue to provide warmth, not just in the moment, but until morning. This practice, known as banking the fire, was as much an art as it was a science. And in homes with only one fire, learning how to keep it alive through the night meant the difference between waking to warmth or to bitter cold. To understand the importance of this practice, one must consider what it meant to start a fire from scratch in the medieval era. Matches didn't exist. Flint and steel were the most common tools for sparking flames, but striking a flame was not as easy as tapping two stones together. It required skill, dry tinder, patience, and time. In wet or windy weather, starting a fire could take the better part of an hour. For this reason, households preferred to keep a fire burning at all times, or at the very least, ensure that embers were kept alive and ready to be rekindled. This is where banking came into play. Banking the fire involved taking the glowing embers that remained after the day's fire had burned down and covering them carefully with ash. The ash acted as a natural insulator, cutting off most of the oxygen while still allowing just enough airflow to keep the coals alive. The goal was to stop the embers from burning out completely, but also prevent them from flaring up into open flame overnight, which could be dangerous. When done correctly, this quiet smoldering fire would remain warm all night, allowing the household to revive it with ease come morning. The process began shortly before bedtime. Once the evening meal was cooked and eaten, the hearth was tidied up. Larger logs that remained unburnt might be removed or pushed aside, and the coals at the center of the hearth stirred gently to encourage even heat. Then, with practiced hands, someone, often the mother, grandmother, or another experienced family member, would begin to rake ashes over the coals. These ashes weren't fresh or gray-white, but the fine powdery remnants from earlier burns. They had cooled enough not to catch fire themselves, but were warm and dry enough to create a barrier. In many homes, the ashes were kept in a clay pot or wooden bucket beside the hearth for this purpose. A flat-bladed shovel or fire spoon was used to gently distribute them. The glowing coals were not entirely smothered, but tucked in like children beneath a thick quilt. This delicate covering protected them from drafts and moisture, ensuring that the internal heat would remain trapped beneath the surface. In some regions, people placed a flat stone or brick over the covered coals to weigh down the ash and discourage airflow, further stabilizing the burn. Once the fire was banked, families would retire for the night, often to rooms or beds close to the hearth. While the fire no longer lit the room, its residual warmth lingered in the stones and in the very air surrounding the hearth. It was a comforting presence, even in the darkness. And should anyone need warmth in the middle of the night, for a sick child, a midnight visitor, or a restless elder, the coals could be stirred and gently coaxed back into life. In the early morning, the first person to rise would return to the hearth to rekindle the day's fire. This task, often taken up by the household's early riser, perhaps the mother preparing breakfast or a servant beginning chores, required a practiced hand. The ashes were slowly pushed aside, revealing the still warm coals beneath. If the embers had survived the night, dry kindling, small twigs, shaved wood, or dried straw would be laid gently over them. A slow breath or a few steady puffs of air could bring the coals back to life, their red glow flaring into small flames. From there, larger sticks and eventually logs would be added to build the fire anew. When the banking process failed, if moisture seeped into the ashes, if too much oxygen was cut off, or if the coals weren't hot enough to begin with, the morning routine became more complicated. A new fire would have to be started from scratch, which could delay meals, prevent proper warmth, and cause hardship on particularly cold mornings. That's why families placed such importance on this nightly ritual. It wasn't just habit, it was essential. In colder climates, banking the fire was accompanied by other techniques to stretch and store heat overnight. Stones were sometimes placed on the edges of the hearth during the evening burn, absorbing heat that could be transferred later. These stones might be moved to sleeping areas, used to warm water, or placed under blankets in especially cold rooms. In wealthier homes, iron grates or fire baskets helped keep coals together in a more compact space, making the banking process more efficient. These tools were passed down through families and cared for like treasured heirlooms. Different regions developed their own methods of fire management. In parts of Germany and Central Europe, for example, homes were sometimes equipped with Kachelofen, ceramic-tiled stoves that retained heat exceptionally well. These masonry stoves, once heated, could stay warm for hours or even days with minimal fuel. Their thick ceramic walls radiated warmth slowly and steadily, eliminating the need for constant fire maintenance. Families gathered around these stoves in the evenings, and beds were often placed nearby for added comfort. Even in more modest homes, the principle was the same: contain, conserve, and manage the heat as wisely as possible. Some medieval cottages, particularly in the British Isles, used hearths without chimneys. Instead, the smoke from the fire drifted upward through a hole in the roof or out an open gable. These open hearths made banking even more important, as there was little protection from wind or drafts that might blow out a weak ember. In such cases, large stones, bricks, or carefully constructed hearth walls were built to shield the embers. The surrounding floor might be covered with ashes or rushes to help reflect warmth and keep the space habitable. The act of banking the fire was also steeped in cultural symbolism. A well-tended hearth was a sign of a well-run household. It represented stability, safety, and readiness. Children learned to observe the process from a young age, eventually taking part as they grew older. In stories and legends, the hearth fire was sacred, associated with the home's spirit or guardian. Letting the fire go out completely was sometimes seen as bad luck or a sign of neglect. In times of grief or absence, the hearth might be allowed to go dark for a night, only to be ceremonially rekindled in remembrance or renewal. Banking the fire was more than just a technical routine. It was a quiet ceremony of care, a sign that someone was watching over the house, even in sleep. It required no words, no instruction beyond example, and no praise. It was simply done, every night, by someone who understood its importance. And in the stillness of a medieval winter night, As frost formed on the shutters and the wind moaned through the thatch, the glow beneath the ash offered reassurance. Tomorrow would be warmer. The fire would rise again. Today, we rarely think about where our warmth comes from. With thermostats and central heat, fire is no longer a household necessity. But if you've ever watched a fireplace burn down to embers, or stirred coals to light a campfire, you've felt something of what medieval people experienced every night. There's a rhythm to tending a fire, a patience and attentiveness that connects us to the past in a quiet, human way. It reminds us that warmth has always been something we've had to care for, not just consume. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happened when warmth was scarce or unavailable. How did people survive when the fire failed, when the woodpile ran low, or when the cold overwhelmed even the best efforts? These moments reveal the depth of human resilience, and the creative, sometimes desperate ways people endured the darkest days of winter. Even with the most careful planning, diligent fire tending, and layers upon layers of wool, there were times in the Middle Ages when warmth simply wasn't available. Fires went out unexpectedly, firewood ran short, illness kept the strongest members of a household from performing daily tasks, or snowstorms made fuel gathering impossible. In such moments, families were forced to draw on every ounce of creativity, endurance, and community spirit to get through the coldest hours. When the usual sources of heat failed, people didn't give up, they adapted. And their strategies for surviving without fire offer some of the most telling insights into how deeply connected they were to the natural world, each other, and the humble comforts they had learned to value above all else. The most immediate problem when a fire went out was that it couldn't easily be restarted. In homes where no live embers remained, a new flame had to be struck using flint and steel, a process that could be slow and frustrating, especially if the air was damp, the tinder was wet, or hands were too cold to manage the delicate work. In such cases, people often turned to their neighbors for help. The custom of borrowing fire was widespread and accepted. A person might carry a metal pot, a covered clay vessel, or even a thick bundle of cloth across the village to fetch a burning coal from a neighbor's hearth. These glowing coals were shielded from the wind and carried home carefully, used to reawaken the sleeping hearth. In this small but vital act, communities supported each other and ensured that no household would be left cold for long. But there were times, especially during long stretches of freezing weather, when even neighbors couldn't help. Entire villages could face shortages if snowfall made foraging for wood impossible. In such cases, families resorted to emergency strategies. One of the first steps was heat conservation, shutting up rooms, blocking drafts, and retreating to the smallest possible living area. Families would cluster together in a single room or alcove, sealing off other areas of the home with cloth, furniture, or even straw bales. Children, parents, and grandparents would lie side by side beneath every available blanket, hide, or cloak. The principle was simple: shared body heat was better than none. In the absence of a fire, movement became a tool for survival. Remaining still for too long allowed the body's warmth to drain away, so people kept themselves busy when they could. Light chores like spinning wool, mending clothing, or sweeping with straw brooms allowed movement without exhausting energy. People took turns stomping feet, rubbing hands, or shifting positions. In monasteries, monks paced slowly through cloisters or stood near sunlit walls when the weather permitted, soaking up whatever warmth nature offered. Children were encouraged to move often, both to stay warm and to help keep spirits high. Food took on even greater significance when firewood was limited. Cold meals, cheese, bread, salted meat, became staples. Dried fruit or nuts, preserved in warmer months, were consumed slowly to preserve stores. If a small fire could be kindled, families prioritized meals that offered warmth from the inside out: warm broth, thin gruel, or spiced teas. In colder regions, people chewed dried roots like horseradish or ginger to stimulate circulation. While food might not have been plentiful during the depths of winter, its psychological impact was immense. Even a warm drink, or a few sips of broth, offered comfort and hope. Another strategy for conserving heat was strategic sleeping. People sometimes slept during the coldest part of the day, and were active during slightly warmer midday hours. They might remain in bed long after waking, conserving body heat under layers of bedding. Families shared sleeping arrangements without shame, fully clothed and tightly packed. In wealthier homes, even servants and nobles might temporarily abandon separate quarters to sleep in shared chambers near the kitchen or pantry where warmth lingered longer. When temperatures dropped dangerously low, insulation techniques were taken to new extremes. Straw was piled against outer walls or over the roof to reduce wind chill. Windows, if any, were blocked with thick cloth, dried hides, or shutters reinforced with mud or clay. Cracks in doors and walls were stuffed with moss, hay, or rags. Even the gaps between floorboards could be packed to slow the icy drafts. Floors were covered with anything that could provide a barrier: extra clothing, reed mats, old sacks, or rushes renewed more often than usual. In rural areas, people looked to natural heat sources. They might spend time in barns or animal shelters, where the body heat of livestock raised the ambient temperature. Families brought smaller animals indoors, not just pigs or chickens, but goats and lambs, who huddled close and shared their warmth. In desperate cases, people even slept near or under hay piles, which provided insulation and trapped warmth when packed tightly. These methods, while not ideal, made a tremendous difference when homes lost their heat. Shelter consolidation was another method used in extreme situations. If one home had better protection or more firewood, entire families might relocate temporarily. In villages, those who had managed to keep their hearths alive became hosts to relatives and neighbors. Churches and guild halls opened their doors. Lords sometimes granted access to heated halls for villagers. These arrangements might be short-term, but they allowed people to share resources and protect the most vulnerable: children, the sick, and the elderly. In some regions, snow itself was used as insulation. While snow is cold to the touch, thick walls of snow block wind and trap body heat effectively. People used packed snow to build windbreaks around cottages or dug shallow snow pits lined with straw and hides for temporary refuge. Some communities built partial snow shelters against the sides of homes or barns, creating a buffer from biting winds. Though primitive, these methods mirrored the logic behind igloos and show how medieval people learned from nature's extremes. In moments when physical solutions ran out, mental endurance became a critical survival tool. People relied on storytelling, song, and prayer to pass time and distract from discomfort. They shared tales of past winters, recited verses, or spoke blessings over each other. The glow of a single candle, the echo of a song in a cold room, or the rustle of straw beneath blankets could help restore a sense of humanity in otherwise harsh conditions. Faith, hope, and memory became a different kind of fire, one that warmed the spirit even when fingers and toes remained numb. Winter cold could be cruel, but it also forged deep bonds between people. In times of scarcity, kindness and generosity were warmth itself. Neighbors shared clothing. Travelers were taken in. Children were wrapped in the cloaks of elders. One household's last log might be given to a sick widow. In these gestures, warmth took on a deeper meaning, one that no fire could match. The understanding that survival depended not only on firewood or blankets, but on community, became a lesson passed down alongside recipes and building techniques. Of course, not every winter crisis ended comfortably. There were tragedies: crops that didn't last the season, families who couldn't find shelter, fires that wouldn't restart. These losses were mourned, but they were also remembered. People adjusted. They planted extra root vegetables the following spring, built sturdier wood stores, taught children to bank the fire more carefully. Even in hardship, there was learning, and it was this resilience, more than any tool or fabric, that allowed medieval communities to endure year after year. Today, few of us will ever face such cold with so few resources. But echoes of these old strategies still exist. We still gather together when it snows. We still light candles, sing songs, and huddle under blankets. And we still find comfort not only in heaters or hot drinks, but in the presence of others. When the power goes out, when the house feels drafty, when winter comes faster than expected, we fall back on instincts shaped long ago. We close doors. We draw near. We wait for morning. In the next chapter, we'll explore how medieval warmth shaped holiday traditions and winter festivals, where candles, fires, and feasting weren't just about celebration, but survival. These seasonal gatherings helped communities mark the darkest days with light and cheer, preserving warmth in both body and spirit. While the medieval world could be harsh and the winters long, people did not face the cold months in silence or sorrow alone. Instead, they turned to rituals, festivals, and community traditions to bring light and warmth into their lives, sometimes literally, sometimes symbolically. These winter celebrations weren't only about joy or religion, they also served a deeply practical purpose, gathering people together, kindling fires, feasting on rich food, and pushing back the darkness both physically and emotionally. In a time when cold could creep into every corner of life, these seasonal traditions offered welcome comfort and a reminder that warmth, both human and heavenly, was still possible. Among the most important winter festivals was Christmas, or the Feast of the Nativity. Celebrated on December 25th, this holiday became one of the brightest points of the coldest season. For medieval people, Christmas was far more than a single day. It marked the beginning of a festive season that extended well into January. Known as the 12 Days of Christmas, this period included feasts, special masses, communal games, and gatherings. Homes were decorated with evergreen boughs, holly, ivy, and mistletoe, plants that symbolized endurance through the winter and brought a touch of green life into gray days. Firelight played a central role in these celebrations. The Yule log, a large, often ornately selected piece of wood, was brought into the home on Christmas Eve or earlier in some regions. It was placed in the hearth and meant to burn for many hours, ideally through the entire night. In some traditions, the log was kept burning for 12 nights, with only part of it burning at a time. People believed that the Yule log brought good luck, and its ashes were sometimes saved and scattered in fields or stored to protect the home from storms and misfortune. More than a ritual, the Yule log was a literal source of heat and a symbol of shared resilience. During these days, warmth came not only from the hearth but from togetherness. Families, neighbors, and even entire villages came together to share meals. Feasts were often simple in poor homes, breads, stews, or preserved fruits, but even a shared bite tasted richer in good company. In wealthier households or monasteries, the holiday table might feature roasted meats, pies, spiced wine, and special desserts. The act of cooking and eating together became its own source of warmth. Ovens blazed, pots simmered, and the house filled with the rich smells of celebration. Every bite was a reminder that winter could be endured and enjoyed when hearts were full. Another significant winter festival was Candlemas, celebrated on February 2nd. Candlemas marked the official end of the Christmas season and the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. In Christian tradition, it commemorated the presentation of Jesus at the temple and the purification of Mary, but for medieval people, it was also a turning point in the cold. On this day, families brought candles to church to be blessed. These holy candles were then taken home and stored for use throughout the year, especially during storms, illness, or other moments of fear or need. The ritual of lighting candles during Candlemas symbolized hope and the promise of longer, warmer days to come. In many homes, candles were lit in every room, placed in windows, or carried around the house as blessings were spoken. For a brief moment, even the darkest cottages glowed with light, and families took comfort in the flickering flames. In northern regions where sunlight was scarce, Candlemas brought emotional relief. It reminded people that the worst of winter might soon be over. In addition to religious holidays, seasonal festivals and folk customs also played a role in warming the medieval world. In some areas, communities celebrated midwinter or solstice festivals, inherited from older pagan traditions and gradually absorbed into local customs. These events often featured bonfires, storytelling, music, and dancing. Fires were lit in village centers or on hilltops to call back the sun, and people gathered to share warmth and fellowship. Though the meanings of these festivals varied by region and culture, their purpose was always clear: to bring light into the darkness. In colder climates, fire festivals continued well into the medieval period. In Scotland and northern England, traditions like Up Helly A, though more modern in its current form, have ancient roots in Viking winter rites. These fire-based celebrations involve torches, processions, and the burning of symbolic structures, often representing the return of light or the triumph of warmth over cold. While these may have been more prominent in later centuries, their medieval roots trace back to communities who understood that light, real or symbolic, could uplift the spirit in hard times. Monastic communities also marked the winter months with acts of warmth and generosity. The Feast of St. Nicholas, observed on December 6th, honored the saint known for secret gifts and care for the poor. On this day, monks and church officials distributed alms, warm clothing, and food to those in need. In some regions, children placed shoes near the hearth, hoping to find small coins or treats left behind by the saint. These quiet acts of charity helped reinforce communal bonds and ensured that no one went without warmth entirely. Feasting itself was a powerful tool in the medieval battle against cold. Large meals with warm drinks and rich foods helped generate internal heat, while the act of preparing these meals created activity and heat within the home. People took care to prepare seasonal dishes believed to warm the body. Spice porridge, hot broths, mulled wine, and baked goods filled with dried fruit and warming herbs. These meals were often shared with extended family or neighbors. Even those with little might pool resources to create something modest but joyful, a shared meal that brought more than calories to the table. Many winter traditions were designed specifically for children, helping them endure the cold months with joy. In some towns, groups of children went door to door on certain feast days, singing songs or reciting blessings in exchange for small tokens or food. These early forms of caroling encouraged movement, laughter, and social warmth. Inside, parents taught seasonal stories and rhymes, played games by the fire, or crafted small toys from wood and cloth. The goal wasn't just entertainment, it was to lift the spirits and keep little bodies moving and warm. Textiles also played a ceremonial role during winter festivals. In some areas, families laid out their best blankets or cloaks for visitors to sit on, placed heavy cloths over tables, or hung decorative curtains to brighten dim rooms. These were more than decorations, they transformed spaces into sanctuaries of warmth and welcome. In certain regions, woolen garlands, felt ornaments, and hand-woven mats were created for seasonal use only, reflecting the special nature of the holiday season. Children sometimes received small pouches filled with herbs or spices to wear around their necks, believed to keep them warm and healthy through the rest of winter. Even music and dancing became forms of warmth. People gathered in halls, courtyards, or around fires to sing traditional songs, many of which had been passed down through generations. Instruments like drums, fiddles, or flutes added rhythm and excitement. Dancing, clapping, and singing together helped lift hearts and raise body temperatures, a simple but effective way to create heat and happiness. In many ways, the songs themselves were like fires, flickering moments of brightness in long, dark nights. Though these traditions varied widely across regions, they shared a common purpose: to bring people together, to create shared joy, and to generate both literal and emotional warmth. They reminded everyone that even in hardship, life could still be celebrated. That warmth could still be found, in flames, in food, in song, in laughter, and in faith. In the face of the coldest season, people didn't retreat into silence. They lit candles, stirred pots, and opened their doors. These winter rituals, so deeply rooted in practicality, also nourished the human spirit. They weren't only responses to the cold, they were affirmations of resilience. And long after the fires had burned low and the last bite of holiday bread was eaten, the memories of warmth lingered, carrying people through the rest of winter. In the next chapter, we'll take a quiet, intimate look at the morning routine of a medieval home in winter, how people woke, rekindled the fire, dressed in layers, and prepared for the day ahead, one careful, warming step at a time. Before alarm clocks buzzed or radiators clicked on to quietly heat the room, mornings in the medieval world began with silence and frost. In the coldest months, waking up was not simply a shift from sleep to activity. It was a calculated and careful process of returning one's body and home to warmth. There was no flipping on a heater, no preheated floors, no warm towel fresh from a dryer. There was only the ember-filled hearth, if you were lucky, and a series of slow, deliberate steps to transform a frigid home into a livable space for the day ahead. The winter morning was one of the most vulnerable and yet most quietly powerful times of day in a medieval household. It required patience, discipline, and a deep understanding of one's environment. The first one to rise was usually the one responsible for rekindling the fire. In small peasant homes, this task might fall to the mother or eldest child. In larger households, it was often the duty of a servant or kitchen maid. Regardless of who it was, that person would climb out from under a heap of blankets, cloaks, and furs, fully clothed from the night before. Sleeping in day clothes was common, not out of laziness, but practicality. Changing into cold garments first thing in the morning was unbearable, and keeping clothes on reduced the chill of the air against bare skin. In some households, individuals even slept with head coverings and woolen socks to hold on to every last scrap of warmth. The floor underfoot was cold and hard. Stone, dirt, or timber flooring had no mercy in winter, even with layers of straw or rushes spread across it. So rising was done slowly. Limbs were stretched under the covers first, easing the shock of cold movement. Once standing, the morning fire tender would move carefully through the dim room. Windows were small or shuttered, and the only light came from the dull gray of a pre-dawn sky or the orange blush of buried coals. If the fire had been properly banked the night before, the embers would still glow faintly under a thin crust of ash. These were the embers of survival, the link between yesterday's warmth and today's possibility. Reviving the fire was a meditative process. The ash was pushed aside with a stick or iron tool to uncover the embers, which were then gently stirred. If still alive, they would be fed a bundle of kindling, thin twigs, wood shavings, or bits of dried straw. A careful breath or two would coax the embers into flame, and as the orange glow strengthened, larger sticks could be added. Smoke curled upward into the chimney, carrying with it the sigh of a household slowly waking. The new fire was not just about heat. It meant food could be prepared, water could be warmed, clothes could be dried, and hands could be thawed. It meant life could continue. While the fire caught hold, others in the household began to stir. They emerged slowly from shared beds, rubbing eyes, stretching, wrapping themselves tighter in cloaks or shawls. In families where children slept with parents, the warmth of body heat lingered a few minutes longer beneath the blankets. Some children were tasked with helping bring in firewood, while others fetched buckets of water, often icy cold, from barrels stored indoors or from wells nearby. Water that had frozen overnight had to be chipped at or thawed near the hearth before use. Dressing was a strategic process. Since many slept in their clothes, the act of getting dressed was really about adding layers, pulling a second tunic over the first, tying on a cloak, wrapping wool strips around the legs, or tugging mittens over half-frozen fingers. In colder areas, boots or shoes were stuffed with straw or cloth for insulation. A cap was essential. Heat escaped quickly through the head, and no one dared go without some kind of covering. Only once everyone was sufficiently bundled would they begin the rest of their morning tasks. In wealthier homes, servants often went room to room reviving individual hearths. They brought in firewood, swept ash from the grates, and laid fresh kindling for the day. Those in noble households might have their clothing warmed near the fire before putting it on, and they were served warm water for washing, something rare in poor households. Even so, rising early in winter was no easier for the rich than it was for the poor. Stone walls were cold, bedchambers unheated, and firelight flickered the same in every room, regardless of one's status. In monasteries and convents, the morning routine was shaped by spiritual discipline. Monks and nuns rose before dawn to attend the first service of the day, matins or lauds, depending on the order. In winter, this meant waking in near total darkness, washing quickly in cold water, and donning layered robes before walking to the chapel through unheated corridors. Silence was kept, but the clack of sandals on stone floors, the rustle of robes, and the whispered creak of wooden doors marked the beginning of the day. In some communities, small warming rooms were made available after morning prayers so that older or infirm members could recover before resuming their work. For the average family, breakfast followed quickly after the fire was revived. The first meal was simple: stale bread warmed near the hearth, a bowl of porridge if grain was available, or hot broth left over from the night before. In good years, there might be milk, butter, or dried fruit. On many winter mornings, the goal was simply to get something warm into the belly before heading out to tend animals, repair tools, or begin spinning, weaving, or baking. Meals were taken close to the fire. People sat on benches or stools, children often on the floor wrapped in cloaks, bowls held tightly to their chests. No one lingered in the shadows of the room unless they had to. Daily chores were shaped by the cold. Outside, snow was cleared from paths, firewood was brought in and resacked, and animals were fed in stalls already thick with body heat and steam. Inside, beds were made, blankets shaken out and hung near the fire to dry if damp, and the previous day's ashes were scooped and used to clean cooking pots or line icy steps. The smoke from fresh fires mingled with the scent of breakfast, damp wool, and earth. Though life moved more slowly in the winter, there was still much to be done, and most tasks began with the warmth that only a small fire could provide. Throughout the morning, families took comfort in small things. A cup of warm drink passed between hands, a thick curtain drawn across a drafty doorway, the way light slowly filtered through frost-rimmed windows. The rebuilding of warmth wasn't sudden, it happened gradually, as every layer of daily activity returned to its place. People moved from room to room, shaking off the stillness of night, setting pots to simmer, and opening shutters just enough to see the sky. Morning was no longer a burden, it became a rhythm, a slow return to normalcy, and a quiet triumph over the chill. In this way, the medieval morning was not just a time of transition but of quiet power. It was the beginning of endurance. It reminded people daily of their ability to manage the cold, to bring light into darkness, and to build warmth from nearly nothing. And though each person played a different role, whether tending the fire, preparing the food, fetching water, or bundling children into extra layers, they all contributed to the same goal, turning a frozen house into a living home once more. The final embers of night became the first flames of day. And in that shared fire, kindled anew each morning, there was more than warmth, there was hope. In the final chapter, we'll take a gentle look back at everything we've learned, exploring how these simple yet powerful methods of warmth helped shape not just survival, but community, identity, and comfort in the medieval world. In the soft flicker of a fire, in the hush of a frost-covered morning, and in the simple act of drawing close to one another, the people of the medieval world created something remarkable, not just warmth, but resilience. Across these many chapters, we've traveled through drafty stone castles and humble thatched cottages, walked barefoot across rush-strewn floors, peered into bread ovens glowing with promise, and felt the bite of cold that never quite left the air. And yet, through every shiver, the same truth has endured: warmth, in the medieval world, was not just a physical necessity. It was a way of living, of thinking, and of connecting. To close this journey, it's worth stepping back and reflecting on what all of this tells us, not just about how people kept warm, but how they endured, adapted, and flourished despite the cold. These weren't just survival tactics. They were values. And though centuries have passed, much of that spirit still lingers in the quiet corners of our modern lives. At the heart of medieval warmth was the hearth. In nearly every home, it was the center of life, a place for cooking, gathering, storytelling, praying, and simply being. Children grew up watching their parents tend the flames. Friends sat shoulder to shoulder beside it in silence or song. In times of illness or grief, the hearth offered light in the darkness. In times of celebration, it roasted the feast and filled the air with spice and steam. Fire was more than fuel. It was the living heartbeat of a home. And the care with which it was tended speaks volumes about the people who lived by its glow. From banking the fire with ash to make it last through the night, to waking in the early hours and coaxing life back into a faint ember, medieval people developed not just techniques but rituals. These acts, repeated daily, weren't grand or flashy, but they were profoundly human. They required patience, memory, and intention. They passed from one generation to the next, building a culture not just of endurance, but of care. In an age before central heating, it was the steady hands and thoughtful habits of individuals that kept entire households warm. Even beyond the fire, We've seen how people turn to layers of fabric, the design of their homes, the arrangement of their furniture, and even their livestock to conserve and generate heat. They built thick walls with tiny windows, slept in shared beds beneath mounds of cloth and fur, and brought chickens into the kitchen on the coldest nights. They covered cracks with moss, wrapped their legs in wool, and hung heavy curtains across doorways. Every item in a medieval home was part of this puzzle, chosen or crafted with the cold in mind. Function and comfort were never separate. Perhaps one of the most telling elements of warmth in the Middle Ages was the role of community. Warmth was rarely a solitary achievement. It was shared, built, and maintained together. Neighbors lent fire when another's had gone out. Families slept in the same bed, shoulder to shoulder. Monks lit each other's candles in cold chapels. Nobles and peasants alike celebrated the Yule season with feasts, music, and shared rituals. Fire was something you gave. A meal was something you shared. A blanket was something you handed to someone else before thinking of yourself. These acts may seem small, but in them lay the true strength of a people who knew that getting through winter required more than logs. It required love. Even the stories that surrounded warmth reflect this deep emotional connection. Tales were told around fires, passed down through generations, not just to entertain but to anchor families in memory. Legends of spirits that protected the hearth, of saints who blessed the fire, of animals huddling together in ancient forests. These stories lived in the flames. And as the storyteller spoke, faces flickered in the firelight, and for a while, everyone forgot the cold outside. These moments mattered as much as the heat itself. Medieval winters were long, and they could be brutal. Crops failed, sickness spread more easily in cold air, and hunger often crept in before the first signs of spring. And yet, people endured, not just by surviving, but by living fully in spite of it. They found joy in winter feasts, laughter in shared songs, and hope in candles lit on dark evenings. They didn't wait for warmth, they created it, in whatever form they could. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. In today's world, most of us can adjust a thermostat, seal a drafty window with store-bought foam, or turn on a heated blanket with the push of a button. But those modern comforts haven't erased the wisdom of the past. There's something deeply grounding about slowing down to tend a fire, about layering up before heading outside, or about cooking a hot stew on a cold evening. These are moments that connect us not only to each other but to those who came before us. People who lived without convenience, but never without intention. In a way, the medieval mindset of warmth invites us to reframe how we think about comfort. It isn't something we're entitled to. It's something we make, nurture, and pass on. It's a cup of warm tea offered to a friend. It's a quilt stitched with care. It's a quiet evening where everyone draws a little closer and the world outside can wait. The warmth we build for ourselves is important. But the warmth we offer others, that's what truly transforms a space into a home. As we close this story, it's easy to imagine the final flickers of a medieval fire, embers glowing faintly under a layer of ash, the room dim and quiet, the outside world wrapped in frost. And yet, inside, all is calm. People rest. The fire will be revived again in the morning. And with it, life will continue, one warm breath, one careful step, one shared moment at a time. So, wherever you are, whether the wind howls outside or your home hums with central heat, take a moment to appreciate the warmth around you. And if you find yourself waking early one cold morning, with a bit of light sneaking through the window and your blanket still heavy from the night before, know that you're part of a long tradition, a quiet rhythm that stretches back hundreds of years. A rhythm of rising, rebuilding, and warming the world, one day at a time. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the warmth of medieval homes. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your favorite chapter in the comments. I'd love to know what strange or surprising method stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay curious, stay cozy, and let the fire burn gently through your dreams.